Good morning. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second and last session of the webinar on opportunities of decarbonization for the waterway transportation in the Paraguay-Paraná Waterway. In the first session of Tuesday, we saw the institutional framework of the waterway. We talked about the replacement of fuels. We also considered preliminary cost analysis and also the view of the national and international organizations on this matter. Today, we are going to have more detailed sessions on infrastructure, port services, energy supply, regulations. We will also put our sight on the future, what happens with alternative energies, and we are going to see important aspects such as funding and its association of these initiatives to the regional development and integration. Moving on to the infrastructure session, loading and supply, 2 blocks. First, moderator will be Cristina Paredes from IDB Invest, and the second session by Andres from OLADE. Cristina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Roberto. It's an honor for me to share this event. I welcome the first panelists for this first session. We have the presence of Mr. Jim Reid, President of the Standing Commission of the Plata Basin Transportation, Mr. Fernando Checa, President of the Argentine Naval Industry, and Mr. Bismar Rosales from the Bolivian Jennifer Port. Thank you. One potential substitution of fuel in the Paraná-Paraguay waterway will require relevant changes in infrastructure. For example, the transformation of new ships, of port ships, of cargo systems for fuel, among others, just to quote a few. So our question now will be the same for the three panelists. What changes has to do with the different sectors' viewpoint. So the question is, what are the change or transformation requirements in infrastructure that you deem necessary in the different sectors that you represent? And what are your comments regarding this? Mr. Reid, you have the mic so that you will tell us the perspective from the ship owners' viewpoint. Thank you very much, Cristina. On behalf of the Standing Commission of the Plata Basin Transportation, I thank you very much for inviting me. This year we had a lot of issues related to droughts and, of course, climate change that's affecting the throughput of Alto Paraná and Paraguay rivers. So we need to look for different actions to mitigate this negative impact. In general terms, we are aligned with the use of existent, already tested technology and the use of this technology that allows us to create more efficient routes and to generate information on the driving guidelines to reduce fuel and have a lesser impact on the environment. Currently, most of cargo shipments and movements in the Plata Basin is through trucks and trains. 30,000 tons, which is transported by an average convoy. You require 1,000 trucks or 24 trains that have to transport the cargo in longer routes. Therefore, as comparatives, more tonnage and more contamination comes from ground or land transportation, followed by river transportation. So to maintain our routes in proper conditions, the river way or path requires less use of fuel. If we compare our waterway with the Mississippi waterway, you will see that our main source for cargo is not through the waterway, but through other types of ways, except for Paraguay, that as from the 90s to date, in the last 30 years, they have had an increase in river transport by 40%. It is necessary to develop an analysis that will allow us to specifically determine the type of fuels and generation and driving systems are more efficient. In order to conclude, we want to clarify that under current conditions, resulting from studies and training processes and adaptation of the fleets and the contribution of necessary infrastructure, our sector will not be refusing any type of modification and the use of alternative fuels. If we need to generate positive impact on climate change, we understand that river transport, as is structured today, is the most effective, most efficient, and less contaminating alternative, but despite this, is the least used one out of all the possibilities we have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ray. Now we would like to invite Mr. Sanchez to share the perspective from the shipyard's point of view. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Argentine Naval Industry Federation, I would like to thank the organizers of the event in order to share with you the vision of my institution. Allow me to quickly show you the worldwide outlook of the naval and maritime industry. This is a summary of a scheme, and particularly what we are seeing is how the system works. The system starts analyzing the status of the maritime naval industry. We have 60,000 ships, equivalent to 1.9 billion deadweight tons. All in all, the transportation, the maritime transportation, represents 85% of the total movement at the international level, accounting for 12 billion tons transported. As I was saying, this is a system that is always trying to find its point of equilibrium that has to do with the input, that is to say, the launches into the system, and the output, which are the breakups. All these organized under the perspective of how the global GDP evolves year after year, based on the fact whether this GDP goes up, the demand will be higher from the global maritime fleet. So as I was saying, this is a very dynamic system that is always looking for the point of equilibrium. So on the launching side in 2018, when this study was conducted, 2,400 ships were launched, representing 24 million tons. And on the output, the breakups, 668 ships were broken up, accounting for 31 million deadweight tons, representing around 28 years of age for the fleet. If we consider the launchings, there are new contracts conducted in that period, around 2,600, accounting from 1.49 million tons of compensation, accounting for around $64 million. In line with this scheme, the portfolio of the ships in construction accounted for 3,600 ships, accounting for 60 million tons, around $30 billion. So interestingly, we should note that 15% of the new launchings correspond to new ships driven by LNG. So If we
llevar a
try
cabo la
to
hidrovía, nos vamos a
include and
encontrar
implement
con una
this same
serie
scheme in the waterway, we are going to
de falta de
find a
información.
series of
La
gaps in
certeza que tenemos es
information.
que el
We know
transporte
for
por
sure
barcazas
that
está estimado
the
en unos 20 millones
transport by
de
barges is
toneladas al año.
estimated in 30
Y donde
million
empiezan a
tons a
saltar
year.
calambres es a partir del
So
análisis de la
maybe
flota,
the
que hoy
uncertainty begins when we
estimativamente
consider the
podríamos estar
analysis of the
diciendo que
fleet. We
en
could
el caso de las
estimate
barcazas a
today
granel
that
están en
in the
las
case of
1200,
bulk
390 barcazas
barges,
tanque, 33
we have
barcazas
290
portaaviones,
tank
85
barges,
buques autopropulsados
85
y la zona de incertidumbre
self-propelled
la tenemos
vessels, but the
en la flota de
most
remolcadores.
uncertain
Un punto
point has to
importante
do with the
para y que
fleet
afecta
of
directamente a la
tugboats.
industria naval ha
There is
sido el
something that
ingreso de
affects the
used.
naval industry,
La buena noticia
the
es que no
entry of
existe
the
un
used
mercado de
of
buques
fleet.
usados, o
The
mejor
good
dicho, de
news is that
remolcadores
there is not
usados
a
aéreamente,
market
con
of
lo cual en
used
este sentido
tugboats.
los armadores que
So, in
deseen
this sense, the ship
innovar en su
owners
flota
who
van a
want to
tener que
innovate in
invertir
their
en
fleets
nuevas
will
construcciones.
have to invest in new
La próxima,
constructions,
por favor.
in new buildings of ships.
Pasando al punto de vista de la
Moving
infraestructura
on to
o las
the
improntas de la industria
infrastructure
naval argentina para
perspective
poder atender
for the
esta
Argentine
demanda
naval
de
industry,
posibles remolcadores
in order to
posibles
consider
remolcadores
the building
LNG,
of
les
new
invito acá a, que
tugboats
me, a seguirme en un
driven
ejercicio
by
teórico
LNG,
que
allow me to share with you
empezamos. Por
this
el lado que el Estado
theoretical
desarrolla
exercise.
una
First,
línea
the
de
state
financiamiento
develops
para
a
que pueda acompañar
financing
a que los
line
armadores
so that the
puedan
ship
renovar su
owners
flota.
and
Y
shipbuilders can
paralelamente,
renew their
desde el
fleet.
punto de vista de la
And so,
legislación,
from the
llevar a que la
legislative
hidrovía
perspective,
Paraná-Paraguay
the
se asemeje más a
Paraná-Paraguay
una zona euro.
Waterway might
En
remember
este marco,
this type of
la
area.
infraestructura de la industria
So,
naval
from that
actualmente cuenta
perspective,
con
the
unos 17
infrastructure of the
astilleros
naval industry
que
has around
en un escenario,
17
digamos,
shipyards.
normal, en un
In
lapso de 9
a
años, estaría en condiciones de
normal
poder
area, in
fabricar
9 years,
108
it could
remolcadores.
build
La
around
próxima, por favor.
108 tugboats. Next.
Esta transparencia se la pedí al ingeniero Podetti, que
I
recientemente hizo una
asked this
presentación muy
slide
interesante en
from
la Asociación
Mr.
de los
Raúl
Argentinos Flota Naval,
Podetti,
donde
who
perfectamente
made a
uno
very
puede
interesting
ver
presentation. And we
cómo
can
son las
clearly
relaciones de todos
see
los actores que están
the
vinculados y
relationship
trabajan
among all
en la
the
hidrovía.
actors that are
Obviamente yo
associated
no me
and
voy
work in the
a,
waterway.
a ceñir directamente a
I
la fabricación
will
de bienes de capital, que en este
focus
caso
on the
son los
manufacturing of
buques. La
capital
próxima, por
goods
favor.
only, which
El
are the
impacto
ships.
directamente en la industria naval
So the
va a
impact
estar
on the
relacionado a
naval
una
industry
reactivación
will be related
de
to
varios de los
the
astilleros, fundamentalmente
reactivation
los que
of
están
several
relacionados
shipyards,
con la hidrovía
particularly
Paraná-Paraguay,
those related to the
unos
Paraná-Paraguay
600,
Waterway,
60 a
around
740 empleos
666 or
directos en 9 años
640
y unos
direct
2.000 a
jobs in 9 years,
2.400
and
empleos
from
indirectos
2,000
en
to
ese mismo periodo.
2,400 of
Y por supuesto
indirect
la
jobs in
reactivación
that period.
de
Of
una
course,
de
the
las cadenas de valor
activation of
más
one of the
importantes que
most
cualquier sector industrial
important
puede
value
tener,
chains
como
of
es
any
el
industrial
sector
sector,
naval
as
particular.
is the
De mi
naval
parte, muchas
spare
gracias.
parts sector. Thank you very much on my
Muchas
part.
gracias, señor Sánchez.
Thank you,
Señor
Señor
Rosales,
Sánchez.
le damos la
Mr.
palabra para
Rosales,
compartirnos la
you have
perspectiva
the
de puertos
mic
y
to share
servicios
with us
portuarios.
ports and port
Un saludo
services
a todos, es un
perspectives.
placer estar en este importante evento.
My
La perspectiva
greetings
que
to all
tenemos
of
desde
you. It is a
Bolivia
pleasure
y
to
la
be a
visión
part of this
portuaria,
important
quería comenzar con
session.
mi presentación
Bolivia's
hablando
perspective
por
and
qué es
the
tan
port's
importante para los
perspectives.
puertos
Well, I would like to start my
bolivianos que nos
presentation
encontramos
by
en el sistema
explaining why it's so important for Bolivian
del Canal Tamengo la
ports.
cuestión ambiental.
We
Primero
are
quería,
on the
siguiente
Canal Camengo.
presentación, por
Why
favor,
is it so
que es la
important to
cuestión de
consider
siguiente.
the environmental issue
El
for
bioma
us?
en el cual nos
This is
encontramos.
related
Nosotros nos encontramos en un
to
bioma
our
que es el bioma
bioma.
del Pantanal. Siguiente.
We are in
Este bioma
a
que está
pan
incluye tres países. Siguiente, por favor.
pantanus
Brasil, Bolivia
bioma.
y
It
Paraguay.
includes
Que
three
justamente pasa por el centro
countries,
es
Brazil,
la columna
Bolivia,
vertebral
and
entre estos
Paraguay.
tres
It
países
goes
con el río
through,
Paraguay.
or it's, let's
Dentro
say,
de lo
the
que es
spine of all these three
el río
countries
Paraguay, tenemos una conexión que es
through
el
the
canal
Paraguay
Tamengo y se
River.
encuentra
So
en el corazón
within
de este bioma. Un bioma
this
que tiene unas
Paraguay River,
peculiaridades
we
muy
have
grandes
the
desde su sistema de
Canal
alimentación
Camengo
y cómo
that
funciona
has
su ciclo de las
very
aguas. Adelante, la
specific
siguiente, por favor.
characteristics and the
Puede darle varias
water
veces hasta que
cycle
completemos.
especially.
Justamente este canal también tiene sus limitaciones y tiene grandes posibilidades. Como dijimos, el ciclo de las aguas es
It has its
diferente del resto
restrictions
del
and
sistema porque
also its
tenemos un calado
possibilities.
mucho
The
más
water
bajo,
cycle
tenemos un
is different
ancho de
from the
canal
rest of the system
menor
because
y
our
tenemos un
depth
sistema de
is
alimentación de
much
reflujo y flujo por
smaller.
parte del
Our
río
width
Paraguay.
is
Esto hace de
smaller
que el
and the
comportamiento del
flow
canal
is
también
different
tenga una
to the
peculiaridad,
Paraguay
sea
River.
un
So
sistema de
the
un sistema
behavior
mayor
of
que un
this
sistema
canal is
camino.
very specific,
Bolivia, desde el año
which
pasado tenemos, en
differs from
2019, se nos
the
otorgó
other
la condición de puerto
system. We
internacional
had
y
last
esto nos
year
permite
the
que
granting
tengamos
of
la chance de
the
nacer bien,
international
nacer con
sports
pie derecho
specification. So we have to
a este
start
sistema
on
para
a
poder
right
comenzar a trabajar en la zona
footing,
vital y la
a
relación
strong footing,
puerto-ciudad,
to be
la
able to start
relación
working on
puerto-medio
environmental
ambiente de una
issues,
forma
the
más
relationship
amigable. Por
between
eso
the port
trabajamos con
and the
tres pilares
city, the
fundamentales,
port
que
and
es
the
puerto
environment. We
verde,
have to make
por la
this
cuestión
a
ambiental,
friendly
puerto
relationship. We
confiable
have
por el
to
tema de que Bolivia
have
tenemos
a
un
new
cáncer creciente
green
del
port,
narcotráfico
a
y estamos trabajando con
reliable
una policía
port. We
especializada
have
con
a
perros para poder
situation
certificar
which
las
we
exportaciones nuestras con
compare it
total
to cancer,
confiabilidad y
which is
puerto seguro
our
por el tema
drug
de
trafficking issue. So we need
seguridad
to
portuaria. Siguiente, por
consider
favor.
all this, and also we need to have a
Es así de
safe
que como Puerto
port,
Verde nosotros
considering all security
entendemos que
measures and
tenemos tres
safety
pilares
measures. So as a
fundamentales, lo
green port,
social, lo
we
económico
understand
y el
that we have to
medioambiental.
consider
Lo
three
social
important
tiene mucho
pillars:
a ver
social,
con la
economic,
cuestión
and
ambiental, por el
environmental
hecho de
pillars.
que el canal
Social
Tamengo, en el canal Tamengo se encuentran
issues
los
are
sistemas de
related
captación
to
de
the
agua
environment. The Tamengo
de tres
Canal have
poblaciones. Esto
the
alimenta a casi 100.000 habitantes que
capturing
se
of
encuentran en la
water
región.
from three
Entonces, aquí
populations. This
viene la principal
feeds
justificativa del por
three
qué necesitamos. No
societies or
solamente es bueno
communities, and
tener
this is the
embarcaciones como
reason
los
why we
remolcadores con
need
energía
to
alternativa.
have
Siguiente, por favor.
vessels
Son cuatro
and
láminas.
ships and
Con
tugboats
energías alternativas, la
propelled
cual nos
by
permite
alternative
tener
fuels.
un canal con
With
un menor
alternative fuels,
costo de
we will
mantenimiento,
be able
con
to
una
have a canal
con un agua
with
más
less maintenance
apropiada, porque de
costs,
aquí nace, se
with
capta la alimentación para toda la
more
comunidad. El
appropriate
desarrollo
water, because this
sostenible,
is then
entendemos, que la
feeding the
capacidad
rest
de
of the
responder a
communities.
las
We need
necesidades
to have
actuales
sustainable
sin
development to be
comprometer
able to
el
respond to our
futuro y
current needs
satisfacer las
without
necesidades de una forma óptima,
compromising the
optimizando energía,
future of
siendo más
these
eficiente y
communities.
creando
We
un
have to
ambiente apropiado
optimize
en un
energy, we have to be
contexto
more
fluvial
efficient, and we have to
marítimo.
create
También
environments
entendemos de que no
in a
solamente son los
maritime
puertos los
river
que tienen que
context.
entrar en este
And we
contexto, sino
understand that
también
it's
la
not
cadena
just
logística
ports that
completa,
need to be a part of
las
this context.
embarcaciones,
The
los
entire
camiones, la
chain has to be
intermodalidad,
involved:
ferrocarriles,
ships,
punto
vessels,
a punto,
trucks,
porque si no causaría un desequilibrio en
railroads,
la lucha, en la
from
conquista de
site
un
to site
equilibrio
in order
ambiental
to
apropiado.
avoid this
Para ello existen
imbalance
tecnologías en el
in
caso de los
our
puertos que tenemos
conquering
que
an adequate
implementar y
environmental
estamos implementando para
balance.
responder
We need to implement new
a este cambio
technologies
del
to be able
combustible del
to
diésel a
respond
otras
to this
energías alternativas.
change
Siguiente, por favor.
into alternative
Por
fuels such
ejemplo,
as
el
diesel
uso de
or other
coolers, el uso de motores de gas que
alternatives,
tienen
the use of scrubbers,
adecuado,
the
que tiene
use
todas sus
of
ventajas en
LN,
el costo y
LNG
algunos incentivos. Siguiente, por
engines with a
favor.
lot of advantages
El
in
empleo
terms
de los
of
power
costs,
supply en
and
tierra para que
also
las
the
embarcaciones cuando
employment
atraquen
of the
puedan desconectarse
onshore
y
power
puedan ahorrar
supplies
tanto
on
combustible como
land
por tanto
so
reducir
that
sus
they can
emisiones.
reconnect
Y
and
las
save
energías renovables
fuels
que cada
and, of course,
puerto
reduce
buscará cuál
emissions.
será la
And, of
más
course,
apropiada, más
renewable
viable
energies.
para su
All of the
situación
ports will
geográfica y
have to look for
económica.
the
En
most
nuestro caso,
feasible
estamos
or
viendo
adequate
el
one
tema
for
de
their economic and geographic
energías
situation. In our case,
solares
we
para
are
distintas operaciones del
analyzing
puerto.
the use
Siguiente, por
of
favor.
solar energy. We have different facilities that can be
¿Qué acciones
installed
vamos a
at
tomar?
the different
Bueno, hay
ports.
muchas acciones, entre ellas las más importantes
Future
son,
actions,
primero, el tema de los
many of
residuos.
them,
En Bolivia
the most
todavía la
important ones
normativa
are
no está
to
muy bien
manage
estructurada por el tema de los
waste.
residuos, tanto sólidos como
Regulation
líquidos. Qué
in Bolivia,
importante es
it's not
porque
well
el
structured,
tener instalaciones de
both for
reflexión de
solid and
desechos
liquid. And this is
hace de que
relevant
podamos
because
captar, por ejemplo,
uh,
entre los líquidos los
waste
aceites, los
management
cuales contaminan
facilities
mucho el tema de
allow
las
us
aguas y
to
eso hace de que
capture
el sistema de
oil
mantenimiento
residue,
sea
which
cada vez más difícil.
contaminate,
Siguiente, por favor.
and the maintenance system
Siguiente.
becomes harder if we do not manage this
Siguiente.
properly. Next one, please.
El tema del bunkering, exigir un checklist apropiado con unas normativas
The issue
más
of
exigentes
bunkering, we need to
y más
have
completas
a
para que
specific
se haga de
checklist
una
with a
forma
more
segura y, por
rigid and
supuesto, evitar
complete
cualquier
checklist
contingencia que pueda realizar. Siguiente.
to, of course, help us avoid
¿Cuáles son
contingencies.
qué sistema de incentivo vamos a tener para que esto se lleve a cabo? Primero,
We
los
have an
line-up para ingresar
incentive
al sistema
system
Flamengo, aquellas
to
embarcaciones que
fulfill
usen
this.
las
First, a
energías
lineup
alternativas y
for
menos
the
poluentes
entrance to
tendrán
the
una
Tamengo
preferencia porque
system.
el costo del mantenimiento del
Those
canal
who
es
have
más bajo
alternative
gracias a
fuels
este tipo de
will have
embarcaciones.
a
De igual manera,
priority
las
because
tarifas
the
de saque y
cost
ataque
will be
serán
lower,
disminuidos. Esto estamos
always
colocando
considering
una
that
alianza con las capitanías
the
de puerto
fees will
para
be
que
different.
estas tarifas
We are
sean menores,
signing a
porque
partnership
justamente
with the different
no obstruyen
capitanías
el
so that
sistema
these
y
fees will be
facilitan la
reduced
navegación.
because by
Otro también
using
es
these
el tema
alternative
de la
fuels,
cuota
they
que
enable
debería pagarse por el
navigation,
tema de
and
de la
of course
captación de los
also
residuos
the
sólidos y
uh,
líquidos. De
fee
esta
or
manera,
quota
como,
to
como
be
puerto,
paid for the
sistema
management of liquid
portuario,
and
vamos
solid
incentivando a
waste.
que las
So
embarcaciones
as a port
tengan,
system,
se
we are
animen a hacer
going
este
to
cambio
promote
tecnológico para otras
and have
energías.
an
Siguiente, por
incentive
favor.
systems for
Si
vessels
puede darle
to
varias veces
want
hasta que cambie
to
la página.
change and include alternative fuels.
Bueno, es esa la visión que tenemos nosotros como desde Bolivia, con el sistema portuario
This
boliviano,
is
el
our
cual no
vision,
solamente por una cuestión
the Bolivian
de
port
una
system,
relación
not
amigable
just
con el medio
because
ambiente, sino por una cuestión de una necesidad
of having a
imperante
friendly
para que los
relationship
proyectos que
with
se
the
desarrollan
environment,
en
but
el entorno
also
del
because
Pantanal
of an
tengan
imperative
éxito.
need
Creo que
so
muchos de ellos
that
han
projects
fracasado por la falta
within
de esa
our
relación
region are
amigable medio
successful.
ambiente, ciudad
I
y
believe that we
las
have to
inversiones
have a
portuarias.
good,
Desde
friendly
Bolivia, un saludo a
relationship
todos. Muchas
between
gracias.
Una vez
investment
más,
in the
muchas
ports,
gracias a los
the
tres
environment,
panelistas por
and
sus
the
excelentes
communities.
disertaciones.
Once again, thank you very much to the three panelists for your excellent presentations. Now I give the floor to my colleague, Andrés Shushny from OLADE, who's going to moderate the second block for this session. Thank you, Cristina, very much. It is a pleasure to share this panel and this session with you, a session that underscores the necessary systemic approach that must be taken in relation to changing the infrastructure in order to generate the decarbonization of the waterway transportation. Now it is my time to introduce Silvia Martinez from the Argentine Naval Industry Chamber. She is representing the naval industry. Teresa Eisenberg, Executive Secretary from the Union of Exporters in Uruguay, that represent the goods, our cargo operators. Also, Cesar Jose Calani from YPF. He's going to talk about the changes in infrastructure and the energy supply perspective. So I give Silvia the floor, and then we continue with the rest. Silvia, you have the floor. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I believe that the changes that we are seeing all over the world, not only in climate change, but also in decarbonization, the IMO guidelines to reduce the contamination by 2030 is showing the importance of the decarbonization in the waterway as well. LNG is a huge opportunity. We, as a chamber, together with the Center of Fishing and River Operators, we've been working for 3.5 years to see what we can do for the country to reduce the logistics costs so that our exports are more competitive. In that sense, we found the proposal of the LNG. It is a great opportunity. It reduces logistics costs in the order of 60%. We know that in the waterway transportation, one cost is salaries and the other important cost is fuels. So thanks to LNG, we can reduce fuel costs by 62%. And another advantage is that it really takes care of the environment. Clean energies also generate jobs, and not any job, but important jobs, hierarchical jobs, innovation jobs. And this allows to have better salaries, for a better quality of life, for a more developed industry, for a higher hierarchy of the industrial production. But we need financing financing, of course. We need public policies that promote, that stimulate, and raise awareness. Clean energies are the modern life. Clean energies are the current fuels, and they have an advantage. The clients and the ship owners can choose what type of propulsion they need. So these challenges call for our need to adapt our infrastructure, our ports, our transporters, shippers, governments, and social stakeholders. Everybody is involved in this change of transforming our fuels towards clean energies. In the case of sustainable ships for our Navy in particular, the project that we submitted is the project of a modern tugboat. When we conducted our research study, there are some particularities for this type of propeller. So according to the need of the shipbuilder, where the tanks will be located, depending on that, we will choose the better setup. This type of propeller and this industrial configuration that Argentina has capacity to build is what makes the industry stand out in the world, reduces contamination, reduces the logistic costs as the plan is, and the construction and building of this type of fleet also creates jobs, skilled jobs for the personnel. So this is not just a gas-propelled tugboat. This propulsion configuration can also be applied to ferries, cruises. Actually, in Argentina, in the south, in Ushuaia, this type of cruises are entering the waters, cargo ships as well, and other means of transport like the rail in the railway system. Renewable energies in the industry in Latin America. Well, we know this is a huge opportunity. It is estimated that the markets by 2025 are going to invest $359 million. This is a market committed to climate change, and we are all upgrading and modernizing our systems. We know that in a globalized world, the role of the industry, we are talking about Industry 4.0, robotics, industrialization. So this is also our chance to be part of the value chain, the substitution of imports, the building of cryogenic tanks, new civil works, planning, so on and so forth. Next. Why do we say that Argentina can be the leader in this transformation to cleaner energies in fuels? Well, Argentina has a huge potential with Vaca Muerta field, which is the world's second reserve. We also have our know-how. We've been doing research for the past 3.5 years. We've met with YPF. YPF is absolutely interested in this project because it was able to prove that not only its own logistic transportation costs will go down, but also it can be as the supplier for the fleet in our rivers and seas. LNG is a clean fuel, is a fuel of the future. Its source is fossil fuels. It is odorless, colorless, non-toxic, non-corrosive. It is mainly composed by methane, the simplest hydrocarbon molecule. It really offers security and safety issues, and it requires, of course, infrastructure in the ports. The LNG setup is related to measures being taken by the entire fleet, by the entire sector. There are hundreds of ships under construction, so it's really something new. Of course, hydrogen-based or solar-based energy is also being studied. All over the world, the commitment to reducing the carbon dioxide emissions and combating climate change is something that unites us. We are all in the same mission, and LNG is the fuel of the present and of the future in the maritime sector. This table was compared together with our engineers and with the center with which we conduct our research, and it has to do with the daily savings and daily yield from this type of fuel. Around $9,000 are saved every day. And if we project this across the year, we are talking about $2.7 million that this type of setup provides to the waterway transportation, benefiting the entire Paraná-Paraguay waterway. So if we really want to recover the participation of the Argentine flag in the waterway, these new technologies are really worth considering. We know that fears must be overcome when we talk about this type of fuels. Ship owners and shipbuilders must really take the chance to make this change, cleaner energies. The main concern we had when we started developing this project was the supply. And that was actually subject that we discussed with YPF, and YPF really took the commitment to understanding the supply. But there are four main systems. We already talked with this with Spain. We have the tank truck at any port, the barges that supply gas to the ship directly or supply from the liquefaction plants to a port, or the changeover of containers, which is a very fast and agile way of supplying. The globalized world is forcing us to be part of these changes, and Argentina has the capacity to make it. Thank you.
Silvia. Bueno, voy a darle la palabra ahora a Teresa Eisenberg.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I will now pass on the mic to Teresa Eisenberg from the Uruguayan Exporters Union, and she will present from the loaders' perspective. Teresa, take it away. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this session. It's very important to say, first of all, that the waterway is very important for us. The truck has to drive 23 kilometers, the train 92, and the vessel around 200 to 300 kilometers. So for the exporters in Uruguay, for foreign train, we use these vessels quite a lot. And the environmental program that we have at our union, we comply with the Green Seal. That means that transportation, logistics, and loads and cargoes have to follow certain standards, especially in traceability and tracking possibilities, considering always the environment. So the state's, the nation's policy, Uruguay, our country, has changed its energy matrix, and it is the country with the highest proportion of wind energy, and we're also going forward with the green hydrogen, biodiesel, and solar energy. And in Uruguay, the population is now consuming and
Pero también
using
tenemos que
solar
tener en
energy.
cuenta que
So
Uruguay no tiene gas natural. Y por
we
eso
welcome this change, but
podremos
you
aportar
need
desde
to
otro
consider
punto de
that
vista,
Uruguay
porque
does
para
not
nosotros
produce
significa
natural
el
gas. So
trasladar
we
el
can
gas,
contribute other
pagar ese
views,
gas y
because for us,
tal vez nos
we need
trasladen los
to
costos a la
transport
carga.
gas,
Por
pay
eso
for
tenemos
it,
que
and
tener
of
cuidado,
course, that
ver
might be
cuánto
then
significan esas
translated
inversiones que van a
into the
hacer
cargo
la
costs.
industria naval
So we need to
y bueno,
consider
después
the
ver el
investment costs
costo-beneficio.
in the
Pero sí
naval
estamos de
industry,
acuerdo en cuidar el
and
medio ambiente.
then we'll
Así
see
que
what's the
gracias
cost-benefit
por esta
ratio. But of course,
oportunidad
we agree entirely
y
on
será
taking care
interesante
of
ver
the environment.
cómo
Thank you very
esto
much
llega
for
a
this
su
opportunity.
objetivo,
It would be
que es
very interesting
transformar
to see
la
how this
logística en
develops to
algo
fulfill and
que termine
achieve its
efectivamente.
end
Muchas
goal, which is
gracias.
to transform logistics into
Muchas
something that
gracias,
also
Teresa.
considers and
Bueno,
takes
y
care of the
toda
environment.
esta ruta
Thank you,
hacia la
Teresa.
descarbonización de la hidrovía no
And
sería posible sin
all
considerar
this
el abastecimiento
route
necesario
towards
de combustibles. Por eso
decarbonizing the
tenemos ahora la
waterway
palabra de César
wouldn't be
José Scalani
possible
de la
without
empresa
considering the
IPF.
necessary
La
supply
palabra es
of
tuya.
fuels. Now we are going to
Bueno,
listen
muchas
to
gracias. Gracias a
Cesar
todos. Voy a
José
tratar de
Scalani
ser respetuoso con los
from
tiempos.
YPF. Cesar,
Voy a tratar de
thank
en
you very
4
much. I will
minutos
try to respect the
poder
time of the
delinear 4
agenda,
ideas
and I will
principales
try in 4
que son las que
minutes
están aquí en esta placa. Y
to
como
be
primera
able to
medida,
outline the main
YPF,
4
la visión que
ideas
tiene es ser una
which are
empresa integral
here
de energía,
on
como
this
esto lo ha
slide.
demostrado en este último
So
tiempo, no solamente
first,
una petrolera,
YPF
con lo
has
cual
the vision
siendo
to
el
become
líder a nivel
an
país en
integrated
la
energy
comercialización de
company.
combustibles, vemos
So,
el
being the
reemplazo o el potencial
leader
reemplazo
at
de
country
gasol por GNL como
levels
una
in the
espectacular oportunidad para
commercialization of
ampliar
fuels,
esa oferta de
we
combustibles
see the
con el
potential
agregado de cuidar el
replacement
medio
of
ambiente, ¿no?
gas oil
Reemplazar
with LNG
combustibles
as a
líquidos
huge
como el gasol que
opportunity
tienen
for
un
that.
material
And in
particulado bastante
addition to
importante
that,
con
we take care
la
of the
combustión de gas natural
environment.
que no lo tiene, es un
So,
upside bastante importante.
compared
El
to
segundo punto
natural gas
relacionado a
combustion,
inversiones
here we have a
que
very
quería destacar,
important advantage.
tiene como
The
dos
second
patas. Por un
point
lado,
is related to
va a ser necesaria una
investments, and
infraestructura
what
para
I wanted
abastecer
to
la hidrovía
emphasize
con GNL.
is related
Y
to
por
the
otro lado,
following.
la
There are
obtención
two
del
parts
producto
to it.
propiamente
We will
dicho.
need
Entonces,
infrastructure to
por el lado de la
supply the
infraestructura,
waterway with
cuando hablamos de
LNG,
abastecer
and on the other
particularmente la
hand, we
hidrovía
need
o
the
el
product
segmento
itself. On the
fluvial
infrastructure
propiamente dicho,
side, when we talk about
vamos a necesitar
supplying the
almacenamiento, vamos a
waterway,
necesitar cañería, vamos a
or at
necesitar bombas,
least the
todos equipos
river
criogénicos que
segment per
tienen
se,
especificaciones
we are going to
particularmente
need
estrictas porque hay que
warehouses,
mantener ese
storage
GNL a menos
pumps,
160 grados y
all
eso no es una tarea
equipment
sencilla.
pieces that
Y por
have
el lado
very
del producto,
strict
¿de
specifications
dónde
because
sale este
LNG
GNL,
must be
no?
kept at minus
Y acá
160
se
degrees, as
divide
you
en
know.
dos.
That's
Nosotros
no
vemos
minor
como una opción
task. And on the
licuar
other hand,
gas natural
where does
que
the
producimos en
LNG
nuestros
come
yacimientos, ya sea
from?
en pozos
On the
aislados o
one
en
hand,
pozos
we
conectados al
can
sistema de transporte.
liquefy natural
Y ese
gas that
gas
we
se licúa,
produce in
para eso hay que
our
ponerle un
own
equipamiento de
plants,
licuefacción y consumir
and that
energía
gas
tanto de
can
la red
be
eléctrica o
liquefied.
con
For that, we
generadores
need a
a gas en los
facility
equipos que abastezcan esos
that
equipos de
consumes
licuefacción
energy
de
from
gas.
the electrical
Y la otra
grid
forma de obtener el
or
GNL,
using
Argentina
gas
cuenta con una
generators
terminal
in
de
order to
importación
liquefy gas.
de
And on the other
GNL
hand,
en Escobar, que lo que
to
hace es
obtain the LNG, Argentina
regasifica el
has
GNL que
an
se compra al
LNG
mundo,
import terminal
particularmente
that
en la temporada invernal,
regasifies
¿no?
the LNG that
La otra
is
forma de obtener
purchased
GNL que
from
no
the
sea
world,
licuando la
particularly during the
producción de
winter
YPF
time.
es
Another way of
bypaseando la terminal de
obtaining
regasificación y
LNG,
bajando
other
o
than
cargando
liquefying
GNL
the
en estado
YPF
líquido
production,
directamente a
is by
camiones para que
bypassing
hagan
the regassing
esa logística
terminal
última para llevar el
and
GNL a los
taking
puntos de demanda, ¿no?
the gas
Entonces son las dos
in
formas de
liquid
obtener el
form
producto.
directly
Y en este
into the
sentido,
trucks.
y pasando al tercer
So
punto,
again, these are the two ways of
existe ya un camino
obtaining the
allanado.
product.
Nosotros vemos
Moving
la
on to the
hidrovía o el
third
segmento marítimo
aspect,
como
there
uno de los
is
segmentos de demanda a los
a
cuales
path that we already know.
podemos
The
pensar el
maritime
reemplazo del gasol por
segment and the
GNL.
waterway
Y ya
is
existe
one
un
of the
camino
segments
allanado, ya existen proyectos piloto en
where
otros
we
segmentos de
can
demanda, como puede ser
replace
el de transporte
fuel
particularmente, que
with
también existe la
LNG. And there
tecnología
are some
para
pilot
reemplazar
projects For instance, in the transportation sector in particular, where the technology already exists in order to replace gasoil trucks and use LNG trucks, and the same for mining companies that don't have access to a gas pipeline. So our perforation and fracking and workover operations, those are sectors that have an energy demand that is not close to a gas pipeline. Those are opportunities to use LNG as well. And as I said before, we have experience, so this waterway segment is in a favorable position for us and with us because we've been working with this product for long. And finally, and the most important aspect, I believe, has to do with the fact that no one will build an LNG vessel unless the supply is guaranteed, is secured. So it would be the other way around. From our side, making these investments into infrastructure and production of LNG is a move that also requires a certainty and a guarantee on the demand side. So, in this equation and in this stage where we are, where we still don't have the segment, we are trying to make it, it's very important to have a clear foresight in order to know prices, volumes, terms, quantities, and quality. These are necessary elements so that we can build and bring the new fuel into the waterway for the benefit of the waterway itself. Thank you.
Gracias, César. Bueno, evidentemente conocer la visión de los distintos
Thank you very much,
actores
Cesar.
involucrados, en
Well,
lo que tiene que ver
to
con la
get
adecuación de la
the
infraestructura.
different
Es el
visions
primer
of
paso
the
para ir
parties
definiendo una hoja de
involved,
ruta,
especially
que
related
vaya en la
to
dirección de lo
the
que recién
modification of
César
infrastructure, is a first
puntualizaba
step
al
to
final de su
generate a
presentación.
roadmap
Creo que
that
esta
walks in the
sesión
same
da
direction
cuenta de
as
eso,
Cesar has
y el
just
objetivo, bueno, era
specified
conocer
in
esa,
his
la visión
presentation. So
de
I
todos los
think that this
diversos
session
actores,
is
que creo
exactly
que
that.
como
The
objetivo
objective,
podemos
the
darlo por
goal was to
cumplido,
get the
y que es
vision
un
of the
tema
different
que requiere un
parties
abordaje
involved, the
sistémico,
stakeholders,
y habrá
and
que
I
continuar
believe that we
interactuando,
have achieved
conversando
our
y
goal.
definiendo
This
líneas de acción.
in
Creo que con
needs
esto doy por
a
terminada la sesión.
systemic
Quiero agradecer a
approach.
todos los
We need to
participantes
debate
y ha sido
and
un placer
generate
compartir
action
con
lines.
ustedes
So
el
I will
tiempo.
conclude this
Que tengan
session.
un
I
buen día.
thank all the participants. It
Muchas
has
gracias,
been an
Cristina,
honor and
Andrés,
my
y a los
pleasure to
panelistas.
share this session with all of you. Have a good day. Thank you, Cristina, Andrés, and panelists.
Damos la palabra ahora a Romina Bocacce, secretaria ejecutiva del Comité Intergubernamental de la
We will
Hidrovía
now pass
Paraguay-Paraná,
on
a moderar la
to
sesión sobre
Romina
aspectos
Bocacci,
institucionales y regulación. Romina, por favor.
Executive Secretariat of the Intergovernmental Commission of the Waterway, Romina Bocacce. It is a pleasure for me to moderate this panel on institutional and regulatory aspects. I believe that it is essential when we implement the use of alternative fuels throughout the waterway. I welcome our 5 presenters. We will start now with Dr. Engineer Raúl Bertero. He is the president of the Center for the Study of Regulations in the Energy Sector and Energy Activities. Hello, how are you? Can you please talk about the regional regulation as a tool for the development of the PP waterway? Thank you very much. Yes, of course. I have a brief presentation. While I present, I will show you the slides.
Hay un teorema que se llama de las
Next
3
one,
R's del
please.
desarrollo. El desarrollo necesita recursos,
There
necesita
is
redes y
a
necesita reglas.
theorem,
Son
the
las
3 R's
las
for
3
development.
R's.
You need
Y el
resources,
Cono Sur
networks,
de
and
América es
rules.
muy generoso en
Networks
recursos.
in
Tenemos zonas
Spanish is
rurales de energía
redes.
hidráulica, energía renovable,
And
litio,
in America,
exportaciones
we
de todo
have
tipo.
plenty
Es
of
generoso
resources,
también en lo que
lithium,
naturaleza
renewable
nos ha dado para
sources
las
of
redes,
energy,
porque
exports
¿qué
of
otra
all
cosa sino
sorts. It's
redes de
generous.
transporte
Also,
fundamentales es nuestra hidrovía?
for
Tenemos
the
ya
networks,
construidos redes de gasoductos
transportation
que pueden
networks.
llevar
This is
hacia las
essential, and our
regiones
waterway
donde
is
tenemos la
essential. We
hidrovía, el
have
GNL hoy y
oil
el hidrógeno
pipes
mañana,
that will
y
transport
tenemos
fuel to different
tal vez una
regions. We
ausencia de lo que
have
son las reglas para
LNG
que todo
today
esto
and maybe
funcione.
hydrogen in
Y
the future,
fíjate
but
que los
we are
recursos están
lacking
en la
rules
naturaleza, pero también
to
tenemos
make it
recursos
all work.
humanos y
And
necesitamos recursos económicos que
resources
tal vez nos
are
falte.
in
Las
nature, but we
redes,
also
algunas
have
tenemos que
talent,
construirlas, muchas están como la
natural
hidrovía.
resources and
Y las
human
reglas
resources. We have
es lo
networks,
que nos falta
some
construir y es tal
existing
vez lo
ones,
que
others we
tiene
need to
mayor
build, but
densidad
rules
económica en
and
términos de lo
regulations,
que uno
this is
invierte
what
en
we're
desarrollar esas
lacking,
reglas y
and
lo que
this
esas
has
reglas
to do
significan.
with
Vamos a la
economic
próxima, por
density
favor.
in terms of what you invest to develop them
Sí,
and
la
what they mean
próxima
for
transparencia.
investment.
Entonces,
Let's go to the
la
next slide,
regulación
please. Next
justamente
slide.
es un extraordinario atractor de las inversiones,
Therefore,
los recursos
regulations
económicos que se necesitan.
are
Básicamente porque lo primero que hace una
a
buena
tool that
regulación
attract
es
investments,
no evitar los riesgos, que
because
son
what
inevitables, los riesgos de la
regulations
naturaleza, los
do
riesgos
is,
económicos, los riesgos de
above
demanda,
all,
pero sí
is
las
not avoid
incertidumbres,
risks
que es
because
lo
they're
que un inversor no
unavoidable
puede manejar.
economic demand or
Un
nature
inversor
risks,
está
but
acostumbrado a
we
manejar
can
riesgos, lo
avoid
hace todo el
uncertainty.
tiempo y es su forma de vida, pero no
Investors
puede manejarse
are
con las
used
incertidumbres. Y la
to
regulación lo que hace
managing
es
risk. This
eliminar
is
las
what they do,
incertidumbres. Y las elimina
but
todas
they
las
are not used to
digamos, la mayor
managing
parte de las
uncertainty.
incertidumbres que pueden
So
existir.
regulations
Cuestiones
can do
ambientales.
away with
Sin
most of
regular
uncertainties
adecuadamente una
that
cuestión
may
ambiental, no hay
exist
un
in
organismo
environmental
multilateral
issues.
de crédito que
Without
pueda
regulating
apoyar
environmental issues, there is
un
no credit
mínimo dinero cualquier
multilateral
emprendimiento
agency or
de
entity that
urbanización.
will
Hay que
be
apuntar a estas cosas con
willing
la
to
regulación. Es
support
fundamental avanzar
infrastructure
en esto si
changes
queremos desarrollar
or endeavors
la
with
hidrovía y si queremos cambiar los
investment. So
combustibles
it
que se
is
utilizan
essential
en la
to
hidrovía. Es
advance on this
absolutamente
issue if we
imprescindible para
want
mejorar la
to
cuestión
change fuels, if we
ambiental.
want to modify
No
our
puede
waterway.
haber
It is
tampoco
essential
avance
to
si
do this
si
to
no está
improve
cubierta la
environmental
cuestión de
issues.
seguridad. Es
And of course, there
ineludible
are
para las
no
autoridades políticas
advances
y tiene que
possible
estar
if we
absolutamente
have
bien
some
regulada,
coverage
aclarada.
for
Fijémonos
safety
en
and
lo que está
security
pasando
issues, and
en el muelle de
also
Escobar
we
hoy
need
en
to
día. Son
regulate
cuestiones que deben
this.
estar totalmente
If not,
definidas
let's see what's going on
y
in the
terminadas, digamos,
Escobar
para que no
Pier.
sea una sorpresa
These are
después
things
para los
that
inversores.
should
Y la
have been
regulación
defined and
debe
concluded to
fomentar,
avoid
debe
surprises in the
asegurar una
future,
distribución
especially for
equitativa de las
investment agencies. So we
responsabilidades,
must
de las
make sure
inversiones, de los
a
pasivos
balanced
ambientales
distribution
y de los
of
beneficios entre
responsibilities,
los distintos
investments,
estados
environmental
parte de la
liabilities,
hidrovía. Esto es
and
fundamental para que
benefits
se avance en
amongst
los
the
consensos,
different
sin lo cual
parties
no puede
involved in
haber
the
una
waterway.
regulación
This
estable.
is
Vamos a la
essential
próxima, por
to
favor.
achieve consensus. Without consensus, we can
Entonces,
have no stable
la
regulations. Next
regulación
one, please.
regional, particularmente, cuando
Therefore,
involucra a más de un país, ya en un país es difícil la
regional
regulación, pero cuando
regulations,
involucra a más de
when
un
we
país,
have
presenta
different
dificultades
countries
que
involved. With
requieren
one
soluciones
country is
innovadoras.
difficult, but with more
Entonces,
than one
hay que
countries, we
pensar
have
en que
more
no se puede
difficulties
hacer
that
o no conviene
require
hacer una regulación
innovation.
restrictiva.
So
Hay que
you
avanzar
have
en lo que se
to
conoce como
consider that
regulación basada en
it's
la
not a
performance,
good thing to have a
regulación
restrictive
basada en los
regulations. We
resultados.
need to
Lo que
have
se pide es, nosotros
performance-based
tenemos que bajar
regulations or results
la producción
focus
de
or
dióxido de
oriented
carbono al tanto
regulations.
por ciento,
We
es decir,
need
hay que
to
buscar lo que se
lower
busca y dejar
CO2
que la
emissions to
innovación y los
an
cambios
X
que son cada
amount.
vez más
So we need
vertiginosos
to
produzcan esos
let
efectos que la regulación
innovation and changes
pretende y busca.
generate these effects
Debe contemplar la
that
regulación la
regulations
situación actual de cada país.
want
No se
to
puede
achieve. We
pretender
need
que
also
de
to
la noche a la
consider that
mañana un país,
regulations must
porque se
contemplate the
incorpora
different
a un grupo,
current
cambie la
situations in
regulación que
different
tiene. Hay
countries.
que
One
saber cuál
country
es la regulación de cada país,
overnight cannot change
basarse en
their
los puntos
existing
que tengan en
regulations.
común y
We
sobre
need
los
to
puntos
know the
diferentes hay
different
que plantear un
regulations in
sendero de
different countries.
convergencia.
We need
La
to try
regulación
to
debe considerar también el
look for
desarrollo
consensus
relativo de
and
cada país
convergence
miembro,
in regulations.
evitando
And we must
concentrar los
also
beneficios en
consider
los más
the
desarrollados,
relative
porque uno de
development
los
of the
objetivos de
member
la
countries
integración regional,
to
la
not
regulación
concentrate
regional tiene
benefits
que
only
ir
on
en
the
la
most
dirección de la
developed
integración
ones,
regional,
because
es
regional
limar las
regulations
diferencias
must try to
emparejando hacia
integrate
arriba.
countries
Y
and
ese es un objetivo
also to
también
do
muy
away
importante de la
with
regulación
inequalities,
cuando
but
varios
always
estados
going
están involucrados.
upwards in the
Por
balance,
lo
not
tanto, debe
downwards. So
producir
this is also
beneficios
very
para
important when
todos
considering
y para que
regulations
eso
for
ocurra
several
tiene que ser el
countries. So
resultado
they
de un
must generate
diálogo
benefits for
amplio
all the
con los
parties
actores
involved. And for
principales.
this to
Y
take
cuando
place, we need to
aparece un
have
problema, y siempre
extensive
aparece, es
dialogue
fundamental que
amongst
haya un
all of the
mecanismo
parties involved.
claro
And
y
when there is a
eficaz de
problem, there's
solución de
always a problem.
controversias.
We need to have a
Así
clear
que creo
mechanism
que
and
estas son
effective
mis recomendaciones,
controversy
la idea
solution
que nosotros
program
tenemos
in
sobre la
place.
regulación,
So these
y
are
me
my
parece
general
que avanzar
recommendations.
en una
Our
regulación
idea
con las
concerning
características que acabo de
regulations is,
describir
as I have
sería
just
muy
described, and
positivo
I
para traer las
believe that we have
inversiones
to go
que la
forward
hidrovía
with
necesita.
regulations such as the ones
Muchas gracias,
I
Romina.
described in order to
Muchas
attract
gracias a
the
vos,
investment
Raúl,
necessary
y
for our
continuamos con el
waterway.
ingeniero Carlos Braña, quien desarrolla varios proyectos en la Facultad de Ingeniería de la Universidad de
Thank
Buenos
you,
Aires y también
Raúl.
es
We are going
director
to
de la
continue with
Asociación
Mr.
Argentina de
Braña.
Ingeniería
He's going
Naval.
to talk
Bienvenido,
about the
Carlos.
developments in the
Y
Engineering School of
nos gustaría que
University of Buenos Aires. Welcome,
nos
Carlos.
diserte sobre
Thank you,
si para tu
Romina.
visión es
We would
necesario
like
un plan maestro.
you
¿Cuál
to
sería la
share
función o
with
los
us
componentes?
whether
Muy bien.
do you think
Si
it's necessary
podemos
to
ir
have a
a la
master
presentación, por
plan,
favor.
and what would it be
Buenos
how
días a
would it
todos.
be composed of? Okay,
En
let's
estos
move
5
on to
minutos
the
que tenemos
presentation first.
disponibles, vamos a intentar
Good morning, ladies
responder a
and
la siguiente
gentlemen.
pregunta.
In these
¿Por
5
qué
minutes
es
that I
necesario
have,
un plan
I'm going
maestro?
to try to answer this question. Why is a
¿Podemos
master
dejar
plan
el paso
necessary?
AGNL librado al mercado? No lo vemos posible.
Can we
No sería
let the
práctico, en realidad.
LNG
Hay demasiadas
be at the free
asimetrías,
will of the
no solamente las
market?
comerciales.
I
Tampoco
don't
vemos
think it is
ejemplos en
possible.
Estados
It
Unidos
would
o en
not be
Alemania.
convenient. There are many
Nosotros debemos
asymmetries.
coordinar entre 5 países.
We don't have any examples
Tenemos
either.
necesidades de inversiones
We must coordinate
complejas en la
among
región.
5 countries. We
Los actores
have
involucrados son muchos, empresarios, gobiernos,
complex
bancos, los
investment
bancos de
needs
fomento.
in the region. The
El proyecto
players
debe ser
involved are
interactivo con
many
otros grandes
business people,
proyectos. Es
banks,
muy importante, por
governments.
ejemplo, con la explotación de gas,
The
claramente,
project
con la
must be
explotación de gasoductos, pero
interactive
también
and along with
con la
other
oferta
large
de
projects, for
bunkering
instance,
de
in the gas
GNL para grupos
exploitation or
oceánicos.
in the building of gas pipes,
Por último,
but also with the
el marco
offer of
regulatorio
bunkering and
que se
LNG
establezca
for
tiene que ser
oceanic
abarcador,
vessels.
cubriendo no solamente las
And
embarcaciones, sino el
finally,
servicio de tierra, el
the
personal, todos los
regulatory
aspectos.
framework
Eso tiene que estar
must be
integrado y coordinado entre
comprehensive
los 5
and
sectores.
must cover not only the ships and
Resumiendo,
vessels, but also the
el
ground
plan debe
services, the
considerar la
personnel, and that
coordinación
must be
internacional,
coordinated
la
by the 3
racionalización
countries.
en
In
el uso de los
summary, this
recursos, la
plan should
interacción con
consider
otros proyectos
international
y un marco
coordination,
regulatorio
the
abarcador.
rationalization in the use of resources, the interaction with other projects, and
Existen
a comprehensive
varios
regulatory framework.
estudios regionales. Dos de ellos son fundamentales. Uno
There
es
are
el
many
IDB,
studies in
al
the
que se ha hecho
region
referencia
that were conducted. 2 of them are
en este taller,
fundamental.
y el
One is the
otro es
study
el
by the
estudio
IDB
realizado en Brasil por el
that
ANTAC,
has
que fue
been mentioned
presentado hace
during
un par de
this
semanas.
workshop, and the other is the
Este último
study
especialmente
conducted by
tiene muchas
ANTAC
similitudes
in
con
Brazil that was
los planes
presented a
que se
couple of
proponían. Sin
weeks
embargo,
ago. And this
insistimos en
last
la
one in
necesidad
particular has many
debido a que
similarities with the master plan that we
hay
propose.
complementariedades
However, we
que deben ser
insist
cubiertas y
on the
además
need
en aquello en lo que nos
because there are
superponemos, el
some
estudio debe
complementarities
ser
involved,
confirmatorio, porque
and
trabajamos en la región
also in the
con grandes dificultades en
matters
cuanto
where we
a los
overlap.
datos.
The study must be
En
decisive,
muchos casos son
assertive.
inexistentes
We
las
know
bases
that
de
in the
datos.
region we
Así
have
que esa
some
confirmación es
data
clave para
problems.
dotar de
Many
calidad
times
a las
databases
bases
are
de datos que
even
se generan
non-existent. So
en
such
el ámbito.
confirmation is key in order to provide quality
Vamos a referir
input
a vuelo
to
de
the final
pájaro muy rápidamente
databases.
otros planes extranjeros que podemos usar de guía para
I
nosotros.
will
El principal
quickly
es
go over
el europeo del sistema
some foreign plans that we
Hidrovia,
can take as a
un plan
guide.
que
The
comprende
main
la cuestión
one is the
ambiental tanto como la
European
comercial.
plan from the
También
Rhine-Danube
utilizar la propulsión
system. The plan
y
involves
como
the environmental and the
los
commercial
ejes de
aspects,
ese plan, en
particularly
detalle, pero digamos que son los
used as a promotion and
incorporación de
commodity.
tecnología
The pillars of
debe
the
ser
plan,
desarrollada.
even though I'm not
Se
going to get
incorpora
into
a otros
detail, have to do
jugadores
with
la construcción
costs,
de prototipos
the introduction
con
of
un régimen
technology, that is to say, the
especial,
technology that
la
will be
regulación y
developed
la
will
hoja de
also
ruta
be
de cómo
introduced for other
programa. Esta
stakeholders,
es la
the special
estructura del programa, es muy
regimes,
interesante, lo vamos a dejar
the
ahí para que lo
regulation,
vean.
and the
Fase
roadmap
de
of the plan. This is
melodía y
the
el tremendo
program
del
structure. I'm
Mar
going
Negro.
to leave it here for you to see it. This is the waterway that you can see up to the north in the North Sea. Allow me to share with you two more plans. One is the Japanese plan that allocates $10 trillion to transforming the Japanese energy market. And it has two main action plans. First, to establish an LNG market in Japan, and the second has to do with the development of bunkering stations. In relation to bunkering, probably we should take this Japanese case as a guide. In the US, the MARAD, the Maritime Administration, has funds with credits, with high subsidy rates around 75% in order to implement LNG in technological structures. So the credit is granted based on a system that can also be very interesting for the region. I'm going to mention the University of Buenos Aires master plan. As I said, it follows the line of the European plan. First, there is consideration made to the LNG propulsion aspects. There is an analysis of the economic impact, environmental impact, and social impact. It also considers the LNG distribution to the north area of the country. And it also offers a regulatory framework, everything under a methodology that finally unifies the entire effort and work and all the professionals involved in this plan. Building prototypes is an essential part of a plan. It provides very important information for the master plan to be effective. Such information should be technical, economic, must also refer to human resources and production. Particularly in the technical aspect, prototypes must be necessarily innovative. There must be an important gain other than the use of LNG just because of using innovative vessels. We are talking about 15% savings in the use of fuel, so we cannot miss the opportunity of getting these advantages, which are very strategic. So we conclude by saying that the master plan is necessary, almost indispensable. It rationalizes the use of resources and it supplements and confirms existing studies. There should be no delays. We can work simultaneously with other prototypes, and it rationalizes the regulatory framework. This is very important, so that we don't go through the experience as we have in other areas where we have a dashboard of rules which are uncoordinated. Finally, I'm sharing this publication with you. This is a longer publication. Thank you, Carlos, for your presentation. And now we continue with Mr. Raúl Podetti, who participates in many projects at the School of Engineering in the University of Buenos Aires. He's member of the Argentine Naval Engineering Association. Raúl is going to talk about the environmental and social impacts of the use of LNG in the waterway. Thank you, Raúl.
Muy buenas tardes. Es un honor para mí estar participando de este panel.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to take part in this session, which deals with environmental and social impact of the use of LNG in the Paraguay-Paraná Waterway. This research have been presented in two publications of our blue collection from the naval industries collection. And the impact that I mentioned, both environmental and social, have to do with the quantum leap between diesel and LNG in
Los
river
reactores de
transport
empuje
throughout
generan
the entire
una gran cantidad de emisiones nocivas
Paraguay-Paraná
con
waterway.
con la combustión del diésel oil. Y
Tugboats
hasta ahora, las
generate a
únicas
large amount
emisiones
of
son equivalentes al
harmful
uso del barril.
emissions
Sin
in the
embargo, ya hace
combustion
varios
of
años
diesel
que
oil,
existe
and
una
they are
vacuna.
equivalent to the use of
Modificando
a
el
face
uso del
mask.
diésel por el GNL,
However,
se
a
pueden
few
reducir
years back,
sustancialmente
we've
los gases
developed
nocivos.
a vaccine by
El volumen de la
changing diesel oil
próximo,
by LNG. We can
el volumen de
significantly
la contaminación
reduce
no está precisamente
harmful
calculada para nuestra
emissions,
región,
harmful
por las
CO2
similitudes con el
emissions.
caso del río Ohio,
Contamination
con
volume is not
un tipo de
calculated
transporte
specifically
en
for a
barcazas,
region,
remolcadores
but
grandes,
we
da,
have
y sobre todo,
similarities with the
prácticamente la
Ohio
misma
River
relación de
with the
potencia y
same
consumo,
type of
podemos estimar
vessels,
que
and
las
above
emisiones
all, almost
nocivas
the same
en el caso
relationship of
del
power,
Ohio
energy, and
son
consumption. We can estimate that
relativamente el
harmful
doble que
emissions
las de
in
la hidrovía
Ohio's
Paraná-Paraguay por
waterway
la relación de
are
superficie.
relatively doubling the
Próxima
Paraná-Paraguay waterway.
Así, el volumen de la contaminación evitable es,
Next
en
one,
el caso
please.
del CO2, entre el 20
Therefore,
y el 9%,
the
en el caso
avoidable
de los
contamination
óxidos
volume
nitrosos
in
y
CO2
sulfurosos,
emissions,
entre un 89
it's
y un
around
99%,
29%.
y en el caso de
In
las
nitrous
partículas materiales,
gases
del
and
71%.
sulfuric acids, up to
Sin embargo, estudios
99%,
endógenos
and
indican aún mayores
particular
reducciones.
are around
Los daños
77%.
Los daños
However,
de la
European
contaminación
studies have
tienen hay
indicated even
daños
more
globales
production.
que tienen un
Damage
impacto en el cambio
of
climático. A eso nos
contaminations can
referimos con las
be of both types:
6.550
global
toneladas anuales
damage,
evitables
global
de emisiones
impact
de CO2
that
que
have an
impactan
impact on climate
negativamente en
change.
el medio
These
ambiente.
are the
Los
6,550
impactos
tons
locales
of
son
emissions of
los
CO2
que
that
tienen
negatively impact the
impacto justamente
environment,
sobre
and the
la
local
salud de
impact,
los que habitamos
which
en la
are
zona de la hidrovía.
the type of
Las
impact that
1.400 toneladas anuales de
concern the
óxidos
health
nitrosos
of the
y sulfurosos y
inhabitants in the
partículas
waterway.
materiales
The
generan lluvia ácida,
1,400
enfermedades de la piel y
tons
sobre
of
todo enfermedades cardiovasculares
NOx,
y respiratorias.
sulfur,
Según
and
la Comisión
particles
Europea, casi
generate
300.000
acid
muertes
rains,
prematuras anuales se
disease
deben a
of the
esto y la
skin,
OMS
and
calcula,
cardiovascular
estima
and
que hay unos
respiratory
13.000 chicos
issues.
entre 1 y 3 y 4 años que mueren por causa de estos riesgos.
30% of the diseases related to this are because of these emissions,
Un
and
estudio de la Universidad de
13,000
Delaware
children die
indica
per
que
year
en
as a
el sur
result
de la
of
hidrovía
these
Paraná-Paraguay,
harmful
las
emissions, according
muertes de
to the
750 personas en
WHO.
lo que va del siglo
In the
es
southern part
atribuible al
of our
efecto
waterway, the
nocivo
death
de
of
las partículas
750 people
materiales
throughout the
generadas
century
por
can
el
be
transporte
attributed
fluvial en la
to the
hidrovía.
harmful
Y actualmente
effect of the material
mueren
particles
100 personas por año.
generated by river transport in the waterway. And
Por eso,
currently,
este es un tema de gran
100
urgencia.
people die per year as a result of this harmful
En Estados
contamination. That is
Unidos y en
why this
Europa,
is
la
an
reacción
emergency,
contra
an
esta
urgency for
situación
us to
de emisiones
address.
nocivas ha sido la
In the United
generación de
States and
áreas de
Europe,
control de
the
emisiones.
reaction against these
Como a nosotros también nos
harmful
importa nuestra
emissions
gente,
have
deberíamos
led to
generar
areas for emission
urgentemente un
controls.
área de control de
And
emisiones
we are
para
also
cuidar la
concerned about
salud
our
de
people.
los
Therefore,
nuestros
we
y
should,
el
as
calentamiento global
soon as
de todos.
possible, generate areas for
Para
emission
analizar el
control
impacto social, vamos
to
a mirar
improve the
el
health of our
tema del empleo.
citizens
Para
and
eso es
to
imprescindible
avoid climate
entender que por
change
décadas
and
en la
global
hidrovía
warming.
se,
Let's talk about
se
job and job
impulsó,
creations and
digamos, la
employment. Throughout the
importación de
decades
buques
in the
usados, casi
waterway,
chatarra, mucho más
we have
contaminantes
driven
que
forward
desechaban
the
los países
importation
más
of
desarrollados.
used vessels, almost
Eso destruyó
scraps, which
prácticamente
is
a los
much
astilleros
more
de la región, aún los más
contamination.
competitivos.
It
Es
generates
decir,
more
las
contamination.
malas
And this was a
políticas
result of
atrajo
us
todo.
importing the vessels that other
Las
countries were
malas
leaving us
políticas,
out.
además de
So
contaminarnos,
poor
nos dejaron
policies
sin trabajo.
have made
Pero
a
como
negative
no hay un
impact.
mercado de barcos
And
usados a
apart
gas, puede
from
ser que ahora
creating
las políticas
contamination,
permitan que se
have
genere trabajo en
reduced
los astilleros
employment
locales.
possibilities. And because we do not have a used
¿Cuánto
market
trabajo?
for
Si
these
tomamos los
kinds of
800.000
vessels,
HP que
maybe we
están
can
en la
generate
hidrovía
or
y les
create jobs
calculamos
in local
el
shipyards.
valor, el
Let's see how
parámetro de
much. If we
productividad,
take into
sumándole
account
el caso
800,000
del gas de 20 horas hombre por HP,
HPs
llegamos
and
a
the
que
productivity
se
value,
pueden
adding,
estimar
of course, in the case
la
of
generación
gas,
de 1000
20 hours per
empleos de
HP,
trabajo
we can estimate a generation of 1,000 jobs throughout 8 years in a row, and this entailed 3,000 total number of jobs created in 8 years. So this is 10% of the Argentine naval industry capacity in the 80s. The 15 regional shipyards can build them, and they would generate a combined capacity of 2,000 workers, which we consider direct naval workers. So we could achieve 100% of job creations in our industry. So in this decade, we will be able to cancel harmful tons of harmful gases and reduce CO2. But the big jump forward is what we need to do to cancel CO2 emissions in order to reach true decarbonization with positive impacts on job creations, at first in the naval industry and also in the creation of biogas and other activities. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Raúl, for your presentation, and we will continue now with Engineer John David Capraz, Professor of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where he is the coordinator for a PhD on oceanic engineering. Welcome, John David, and we would like to talk about the different technical aspects that you think should be considered in order to assess different alternative fuels throughout the waterway. And do you think that this would be beneficial to achieve a flexible outlook?
Thank you very much, Romina, for the opportunity. I would like to expose here the strategies of the International Maritime Organization to reduce emissions or CO2 and greenhouse effect gases. Our goal is to reduce by 50% in the absolute emissions of CO2 compared as a reference year 2008, as you might see here. Taking into account the inland waterways navigation, there are three ways to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions. The first and foremost involves new vessels projects and innovation of the existing fleet, since new motors are more efficient than the old ones. A second methodology is related to the operations, for example, where there are new technologies, new kinds of paint, in order to reduce the consumption of fuels and emissions. And the third is innovation in the use of new fuels, and that will be the green part of this image you see here. Among the most efficient methods, as you may see in this slide, we find the methods related to the new vessels projects and the operational methods which are directly applied nowadays. Although in the future we count with the participation of the green part, where you can see there the new fuels, for example, it is interesting to mention that there are different options of fuels with zero emissions. Their availability nowadays, unfortunately, is not that wide, but I'd like to highlight certain points here, such as, for example, bio-LNG, the new fuel of zero emissions, but an excellent transitional fuel. Our specialists foresee that in future there will be not only one fuel, but a mixture of fuels towards zero emissions. Among them, you can find here bio-LNG and e-LNG, based in hydrogen. There is a list of criteria that have to be considered in order to create a good fuel. Here we see the technical, the economic, and the environmental criteria. And here I would like to express, as per my own evaluation, what we need for the fossil LNG. Here you see that the availability is a problem that we have already solved, although the density of this fuel is lower than the current fossil fuels density. We can have half of the density in LNG compared to the current fossil fuels. The standards, applicability, technological maturity are excellent. We have hundreds of thousands of vessels using this, and security as well has been managed correctly. Operations are conducted with safety, but a potential problem is the stability of this fuel in the long term. When you supply a vessel with LNG, you will need it to be consumed fast. It's not possible to leave LNG several days in the tank of the vessels. In fact, LNG will start to evaporate, and that's a great risk to the environment if LNG is not used or burned. From the economic perspective, you know that it reduces capex. LNG needs the authorization of all the vessels and the port structure. Although we can show the voyax, the bunker costs, this technology takes into account these characteristics. From the environmental perspective, there's a great advantage towards the local sustainability. In fact, LNG reduces emissions, the particulate emissions, and impacts on water. Although it's not the best solution for the global sustainability, because it still has carbon, and there are alternative options towards the future. Before I finish, I would like to highlight the four main points. LNG is not the only option towards the future. It is important to maintain the technical flexibility of this fuel. There's a possible solution of dual fuel motors that burn gas or fossil fuels. Fossil LNG is an excellent fuel that reduces the NOx, SOx emissions, particulate emissions, but not CO2 that much. LNG requires a pilot fuel, which is a technical fact very often forgotten. In order for you to have LNG, you need to have fossil fuels, and you need to inject that with 1%. So you need to eliminate completely the fossil fuels in that step. We also need liquefaction, which is a cost of energy. You need dual fuel motors. We need new tanks in the new infrastructure of our vessels and ports. And finally, we need a new infrastructure that has to be considered in order to implement this new fuel. The last point I wanted to share with you is related to the carbon leaks. In case of LNG leaks, this has to be studied in order to be completely eliminated, because an LNG leaks causes 25 times more damage when compared to CO2 in terms of greenhouse effect. Thank you very much, Romina, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Y ahora continuamos
Thank you, Jean-David,
Él es un
very much
consultor
for your
independiente con
presentation.
vasta
And now we are
experiencia en el
going
sector
to
de
listen
petróleo
to
y gas
Carlos
debido a
Weiss.
su
He is
carrera
an independent
profesional en
consultant
IPF.
with vast
Bienvenido,
experience in the
Carlos.
oil
Gracias
and
por
gas
estar acá.
sector, thanks to his
¿Y
professional
cuáles son los
career.
principales
Carlos,
desafíos en
welcome. Thank you for
materia
being
de
part of
seguridad?
this session.
Okay.
What
Muchas
are the
gracias,
main
Romina.
challenges
Es un placer
in
poder participar
security
en
aspects?
este evento.
Thank you,
Bueno,
Romina. It
ahí
is a
tengo una
great
pequeña
pleasure
presentación.
to
Si
be
por favor
part of
podemos
this
ponerla.
event. I
Okay.
have
Bueno,
a
podemos ir
brief
al
presentation.
siguiente
Let's
slide,
see
por
if I
favor.
can show it to you.
Bueno, ante todo,
Next
tenemos que
slide.
saber que en materia de seguridad tenemos
First of
premisas
all,
básicas que
it is
son
very important
irrenunciables.
to remember
Nada es
that
tan
in terms of
importante ni tan
safety and
urgente que se
security,
pueda
there
hacer
are
sin considerar la
important
seguridad.
premises. Nothing
La
is as
segunda es que la
important or
seguridad
as
no se
urgent that could
negocia.
be done
Y
without
tercero,
considering
lo que hoy es
safety.
seguro,
Second,
mañana
safety is
puede
not
dejar de ser.
negotiated. And third,
Mencionado esto,
what is
podemos decir que
certain or
toda
safe
industria o
today
actividad
can
humana se
be no
caracteriza
longer
por la
safe
posibilidad de
tomorrow.
generar
So
riesgos de
any
diversa
industry,
naturaleza que
any
afecten la
human
integridad física de los
activity
trabajadores, el
has
medio
and
ambiente o que
entails
generan
certain
pérdidas en la
risks
producción
that
de las
can
empresas que
affect
las
the
desarrollan.
physical integrity
Por
of
eso la seguridad
workers,
tiene
the
un papel tan
environment,
importante y
or
tan
causing
preponderante
losses
en todas las
in the
actividades.
companies. That's why
Dicho
safety
esto,
has
se deben
such an
establecer
important role in each and every
normativas y
activity.
lineamientos que permitan elaborar e implementar
After
mecanismos,
saying this, it's
procedimientos
very
y
important
sistemas
to
de
establish
seguridad
regulatory
con el fin de
frameworks and
reducir a un mínimo
rules
la probabilidad
that
de
can
consecuencias
provide
deseadas,
for
en última
safe
instancia
systems and
mitigar los
mechanisms
riesgos
in order to
existentes en
reduce
toda
to
la
the
cadena de operación.
minimum
Aquí nos
undesired
referimos no solo a
consequences
la
or
seguridad en la
ultimately
construcción de
mitigate
embarcaciones,
those
remolcadores,
risks
buques,
throughout the
instalaciones de
entire
superficie,
production chain,
sino
not
también
only in
a
relation to
la
building
seguridad
vessels,
correspondiente a todos
warehouses,
los actores y a
facilities,
todas las
so on and so
operaciones
forth, but
de las
also
actividades.
safety aspects
Considerando lo
related
mencionado, es
to
fundamental
each
llevar
and every
siempre la
player and
estadística de
activity
todos los
involved in the
accidentes e
sector.
incidentes,
Therefore, it's
de modo que
very
esto pueda ser
important
utilizado
to
por los
keep
los
the
especialistas para que
statistics
se
of each and
determinen nuevas
every
formas de actuar y
incident
que
and
ayuden a
event
mejorar el sector
so
en
that
general.
experts can follow those
Lo dicho
records
hasta
and
aquí
decide
puede
on
ser
better ways of
aplicable
acting
independientemente del tipo
and
de combustible que
improving
se
the
utilice en el transporte
mechanisms.
fluvial en la hidrovía.
All
Si
these
bien en los
can be
últimos años,
applied
especialmente en
regardless of the
Europa,
type of
Estados
fuel
Unidos,
that is
Japón y
used
algunos
in
otros
the
países del
waterway
Oriente, se
transportation.
viene trabajando en
Even
el
though in
desarrollo de
recent years in the
alternativas
US
para
and the
motorizar
US and
las
some areas in the
embarcaciones.
Middle East,
Hoy
efforts
quiero
have
hacer
been
foco
made to work
especialmente
on
en
certain
la seguridad y el
alternatives
GNL,
for
porque
vessels and
entiendo que es
ships.
lo que se
Today,
viene
I would like to
imponiendo
focus
en los
especially
países
on
mencionados
safety
desde hace
and,
un
and
tiempo, ya
LNG
sea
because
por
I
razones
understand that this is
ambientales
the trend
y razones
for a
económicas,
few
y a mi
years
juicio es el
now,
camino que deberíamos estar
whether
siguiendo
due
en
to
la hidrovía
environmental reasons or
la próxima
economic
década.
reasons. And in my opinion,
Como sabemos, el
this is
GNL
the
no es otra
trend
cosa que
that
el
should
gas
be
natural, el metano, el
assimilated
gas
in the
natural que
waterway
recibimos
too.
en casa habitualmente,
LNG
que
is
se
nothing
enfría
but
a menos
methane
161
natural
grados
gas, the
y
one that we
pasa de esa
even get at
forma a un
home,
estado
which
líquido. En
is
este
cooled
estado
at
se reduce
minus
600 veces el
161
volumen y
degrees
nos permite
and
el
is transformed
almacenaje
into
y
liquid. So
transporte.
the volume is
Cabe
reduced
señalar que en ningún
600
momento
times and
el
we
gas
are able
natural
to
cambia sus
store and
propiedades, por lo que
transport it
permanece incoloro e
accordingly.
inodoro.
So
Podemos
natural
pasar a la
gas
siguiente.
changes its properties,
Pero
but it remains
no,
colorless and
puede ser que haya una
odorless.
anterior.
Let's see if I can
Ahí.
show you the
¿Cuáles son los
next
principales
slide.
aspectos ambientales y de seguridad que tiene el GNL y que debemos
What
tener
are
en
the
cuenta
main
para considerar
environmental and
al momento
safety
de tomar una
standards
decisión si
for
vamos o no a
LNG?
utilizar
What
este
we
producto?
should take into account
El GNL
when
al
it comes to making
vaporizarse
a
forma nubes de
decision
metano, las
in
cuales
order to use this
rápidamente suben
product.
a la
When
atmósfera a
evaporating,
medida que
the
se vaporizan.
LNG
El GNL
forms
no es tóxico.
methane clouds
Sí es
which quickly go
asfixiante como
up into
cualquier
the
gas si
atmosphere.
desplaza el
LNG is
oxígeno
not
de la
toxic.
zona.
It is
El GNL no es
asphyxiating as
almacenado a
any
presión, por lo que
gas because
eventualmente
oxygen
la
is
nube
displaced from
presenta
the
riesgo
area.
de
LNG
deflagración,
is
pero
not
no de
stored under
detonación, salvo que
pressure,
ingrese
so
en un
this
sitio
cloud
confinado.
poses the risk of deflagration but not detonation. And finally, LNG is not mixed with water. When coming into contact with water, it just evaporates. So this sounds dangerous or risky, and in general, we must emphasize that in the, let's say, in the past years, when the operations with LNG started, some 35 accidents were reported, and only 5 were severe accidents, and all of them were offshore, not onshore or on board. In general, these accidents were also involving certain technologies that are no longer used at present. These accidents, as I said, were never produced on board the vessels that transport or use LNG. There are many international safety and security codes that must be implemented when using LNG. These are regulations that establish requirements for the personnel and crew. There are also mandatory provisions for the surveillance and monitoring of each and every equipment and unit using LNG, not only on board the vessels, but also on the land facilities and centers that will probably need to be set up on the coast or on the shore. It is also very important to consider that a high percentage of accidents were and are caused by human error. In general, they are caused by an inadequate training of the staff. So the human factor is a crucial element when it comes to taking into account the waterway safety and security. So unless we have the codes, or if we have the codes but we don't have trained personnel, the whole system will be at risk. In conclusion, we can say that the main challenge that we have for the future, if we really want LNG to be included as a fuel in the waterway, we need to simplify and coordinate the different systems and operation controls so that we can reduce uncertainties and costs for companies. We need to have transparency and harmonized criteria. This is something that Raúl mentioned in his presentation. The regulatory aspect is key. And finally, safety for the community, especially for those cities and towns which are located in an area of operations of the waterway. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Carlos, a vos. Aprovecho para felicitar a los 5 panelistas.
Thank you,
por sus
Carlos.
excelentes
I take
presentaciones.
advantage
Cierro
of
entonces
this
el panel
opportunity to
destacando algunas
congratulate
ideas
all 5
clave que me
panelists
parece
for
que
these
fueron
brilliant
expuestas
presentations. I will
por los
now
panelistas.
close
Primero,
this
la regulación
session
es claramente
by
un aspecto
summarizing key
esencial para
ideas.
poder implementar
Regulation
el uso de
is
combustibles
clearly an
limpios en
essential
hidrovía.
aspect
Y
to
la
be able to
regulación debe
implement the
comprender
use of
una serie de
clean
elementos,
fuels
aspectos
throughout the waterway,
jurídicos,
and
económicos,
regulations must
financieros,
encompass
técnicos,
several
de seguridad.
issues: legal
¿Y por qué
issues,
la regulación es tan
economic, financial
importante?
issues,
Porque
technical and
reduce las
security and
incertidumbres,
safety
da
issues. And why is
previsibilidad,
it so
seguridad
important? Because
jurídica,
it
al establecer
reduces
reglas de juego
uncertainty,
claras para los
provides
actores. Y esto es
what to
fundamental para
expect.
poder planificar
It
a largo
establishes
plazo y realizar
clear
todas las
rules
inversiones
of
y
the game.
transformaciones
This
que
is
son requeridas.
essential to
Pero
have
también, como
future
fue dicho por los
planification to
panelistas,
carry out all the
la regulación
required
no debe encorsetar,
modifications
debe
and
permitir y
transportations.
fomentar la
But also,
innovación,
as
porque
panelists
se trata de
said,
tecnologías que están
regulations
en
must be
constante
flexible
evolución,
to
son
allow
muy
for
dinámicas.
innovation
En
because these
síntesis, la
technologies
regulación
are
es un papel
dynamic, evolving
preponderante para avanzar
constantly.
hacia la
Therefore,
descarbonización del
regulations are
transporte en la hidrovía.
essential to go
Gracias y
forward
seguimos
with
con el taller.
decarbonization of
Muchas gracias,
transport
Romina
throughout the
y
waterway. Thank you
panelistas.
very much, and we'll continue with the workshop. Thank you very much, panelists.
Bien, continuamos ahora con la sesión
We will
de energías
continue
alternativas hacia
with
cero
our
emisiones.
alternative
En el
energy
estudio que hicimos
session
Mini-OLADE
towards
hemos
zero
analizado
emissions.
distintas
We
alternativas
have
hacia una
analyzed
transición
different
energética, por
alternatives
supuesto, en el sector de
towards
navegación, por
an
supuesto, teniendo
energy
en cuenta temas de
transition in the
temporalidad, disponibilidad
navigation sector,
comercial,
considering
costos,
timeliness,
instalaciones, suministros,
availability,
etc. Nos
cost,
gustaría mucho conocer
supplies,
la opinión
etc.
de
We will
especialistas,
now
expertos, y tenemos
hear
un
the
panel
opinion
muy
of
interesante
experts.
que amablemente
We
se nos
have a
une hoy,
very
que le damos la
interesting
bienvenida y me
session with
gustaría presentar
panelists
para conocer
that
sus
will
opiniones en esta
give us
transición
their
energética,
point of view
específicamente en
in
el
this
sector de
energy
navegación
transition,
fluvial.
specifically in the
Damos la
river
bienvenida a
transport
Fernanda
sector.
Sarmento,
I
consultora
welcome
experta de
Fernanda
Brasil,
Sarmento, expert
Pedro Domaninsky,
consultant from Brazil,
experto
Pedro
representante de
Domaninsky,
Paraguay, y
expert
Martin
from
Koopman del
Paraguay,
puerto
and
de
Martin
Rotterdam.
Koopman from the
Fernanda,
Rotterdam
empezamos
port.
contigo, por favor, si
Fernanda, we
pudieras
will begin
amablemente
with you.
compartir cuál es la
Could you
visión
please
que ustedes
kindly
tienen
share
en la
your
transición
vision as
energética
to
para la
the
navegación
energy
fluvial.
transition
Adelante,
for
Fernanda, por
river
favor.
transport? Go ahead, Fernanda.
Good morning, everyone. As you know, decarbonization is a market trend in navigation, and we need to advance in technology. Nowadays, we have this environmental problem, and we have the Paris Agreement that helps us understand the situation. So we need to translate that preoccupation to a reduction of 50% of the greenhouse emissions gases until 2050. So we need to have a strategy to reduce by 40% up to 2030 and the rest until we reach 70%. So our worriness with the environment is translated into our society and navigation through our ports. So we need to see how to use these alternative fuels. Okay, so there are different fuels. Time is very important here. So we'll change one kind of energy in our fleet in a short period of time. And of course, that takes time because we need to invest in our future. We need to understand the availability, certifications, safety. So in order for us to show how to reach that energetic transition, in this slide, you see a study that was conducted that shows that we need to have a gradual transition through LNG, which is the great candidate to reduce the greenhouse emissions gas up to 2040. From that year on, there will be a trend to change fuels in order to use other carbon neutral fuels such as nitrogen or others. Renewable sources still have not been updated, so we need to incorporate other kind of technology in navigation. And we also need to have pre-established norms in order to innovate and implement new technologies that have to be approved by local authorities. This table shows the results of a study that compares different alternatives, indicating the performance of every fuel, and that compares them with different parameters. So on the one hand, you see the renewable fuels that we need to see and consider in terms of maturity. And here we have two kinds of fuels, such as ammonium, hydrogen, the cost of these energies, the battery, which is a challenge in terms of navigation, the limited availability of fuels, and on the left you see the fossil fuels that represent emissions problems. Next slide, please. Okay, so in order to sum up, decarbonization in navigation will happen anyway. LNG will help us. We need to find carbon neutral fuels up to 2050. And in the Paraná-Paraguay Waterway, we see very important potential, such as LNG, in the whole countries that go through this waterway. The challenge will be to have an infrastructure to supply their vessels with LNG. Also, to verify the importance of inland waterways, navigation, and of course, there are possibilities in terms of agribusiness and batteries. The hybrid battery is another possibility. So this is a whole challenge, but this is something that we need to consider. That's what I wanted to share with you. My next slide is just to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conference.
Muchísimas gracias, Fernanda. Muy clara tu presentación y nos conecta muy bien con la pregunta que queremos hacerle a Pedro también. Pedro, por favor, ¿podrías contarnos cómo ven ustedes la aplicación de las energías renovables en la navegación fluvial, por favor, hacia cero emisiones?
Sí. Bueno. Interesante, muy interesante la presentación de Fernanda.
Well, very interesting point, very interesting Fernanda's presentation. In the Paraná-Paraguay hydrowave, although we have these evolutions as to the transport side, where we see that we have gone from 700,000 tons in 98 to almost 36 million tons. And this is a trend into the future that visualizes almost 50 million tons in 2030. So this brings about higher energy consumption, and this higher consumption allows us a range of alternatives or possibilities, always talking about energy, of course. We have different alternatives, but basically, in the current context that we visualize, well, one might say we have a range of alternatives, and I have to assess the different components. We need to have a timeline, we need to have different alternatives, and also the hybridization timeline. And sometimes I understand the consolidation of the spectrum of renewals. And we think it is applicable, it's feasible, even with these tugboats that you can see on screen, the solar photovoltaic energy use, not just by providing support to battery systems, but also for direct injection systems. We see a barge, for example, and we calculate almost 90, 100 HP, and in some cases with some panels, almost 150 HPs per barge of electric generation that can be complemented with gas systems or also fuel oil systems or diesel systems. So this allows this hybrid system that support and supplement cost reduction. In electromobility, has to consider the kilometer, that is almost 14 cents of a dollar. The cost in Paraguay, at least. And also, in the transformation side, in electric mobility, we are talking of less than 1 cent of a dollar per kilometer. So imagine what this change would be based on renewable sources, of course, to this supplementation of the propelled systems. So we are talking about a high percentage of savings. And the studies that we've been assessing are studies that are talking about complementary systems for direct injection. In battery-driven vessels, well, that's the biggest part, but we are talking about a complementary line or supplementary line. And why do we say that it's an important possibility for us? Well, because the curve, the learning curve, based on our experience, will be improving more and more if we talk about manufactured equipment. In the tugboats, well, we see an improvement in the value scheme. So in the manufactured products, we have a curve where we have more production, the market demands more, and costs start dropping. However, in the schemes where resources are scarce, costs, as they grow, they start going up. So we will have a curve where both dots will meet, and I think we are beyond that crisscrossing of the curves. Therefore, the technology of renewables will not only be useful for the battery-based vessels, but also for the vessels of direct injections. These are new technologies. Of course, this added to the entire development for fuel cells, different types of hydrogen-based injections for propulsion systems. And when we talk about natural gas, we must also consider biodigestion or biogas, because they can also be used as contributors. So this is an entire range that has to be, of course, opened up more and more. This is all based on research, and we shouldn't restrict ourselves. We should think about the hybrid systems, conventional, traditional systems, but also with some hybrid systems, and we need to go forward in the study of new renewables, specifically applied in large areas such as the surfaces. We have like 20 or 30 barges. These are big surfaces, and we can take advantage of wind and solar energy in this part of the continent. Thank you very much for your invitation, and we will work together with our team, together with the Waterway Commission, to go forward with this great possibility of application of renewables in our waterway. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pedro, very much. And more or less in line with what you said, Pedro, and what Fernanda said before. And now I would like to invite Martin Koopman from the Rotterdam port, who's going to share with us a pilot project that they implemented in Europe, in the Rhine River, for zero emissions. And then a little bit more to the future, some innovative solutions they are thinking about in zero emissions. Martin, you have the floor.
Doing in terms of new fuels. At the Port of Rotterdam, we are looking at all sorts of alternatives, and the first key solution that we found for inland shipping is actually the electrical solution. So what we've done is we've set up a company called the Zero Emission Shipping Company. It's gone live 2 months ago. And we aim to operate 7 electrically driven vessels on the River Rhine towards Germany within a year from now. This is the first phase, and it will be followed shortly with hydrogen on top of it, hydrogen to be used to fire fuel cells and again to drive the electrical engines of these barges. This is only the beginning, and the Port of Rotterdam has many, many more interesting solutions. So have fun looking at this video.
The climate goals cannot be achieved without the contribution of the inland shipping sector. ZES has taken the lead in the transition in inland shipping with 100% green energy and no CO2, nitrogen, or particulates emissions. ZES is short for Zero Emission Services. ZES provides rechargeable energy containers for new and existing inland vessels. These containers are loaded with green energy. Once the energy has been depleted, the captain can easily switch the empty container for a full one at one of the switching and open access charging stations. The stations can also be used to stabilize the electricity network or provide electricity temporarily at a facility. ZES has a simple payment system. You only pay for the electricity consumed and the use of a ZES pack. ZES offers users a future-proof solution. For example, the ZES packs can also be used for hydrogen in the future. ZES is the result of a partnership between ENGIE, ING, the Port of Rotterdam, and Wärtsilä. These organizations founded ZES with the support of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. Right from the start, ZES has partnered up with Heineken and its transport company CCT. Heineken, which exports around 70,000 containers of beer each year, will join with ZES for 10 years to have its export beer transported emission-free from its breweries to the Port of Moerdijk and eventually the Port of Rotterdam. In the years to come, ZES will grow with more switching and charging stations, more shipping routes, and more vessels. The ultimate goal is to achieve 100% green and emission-free inland and short sea shipping.
One of the many initiatives that we are developing. We're taking a leading role. We're taking a leading role in a lot of the energy transition projects.
Electrical shipping is of course the beginning. Electrical shipping, as mentioned, is of course the beginning. The next stage, as mentioned, using hydrogen. The next stage will be even longer hydrogen. For even longer hydrogen and fuel cells, hydrogen and fuel cells on top of the electrical. And we believe that this is a really good. And we believe that this is a really good solution for river transport. Also on the sea side, we are looking at alternative fuels, methanol, ammonia. We're looking at circular solutions. We're looking at circular solutions. We're looking at a new hydrogen backbone. Many really interesting initiatives. Many really interesting initiatives to decarbonize. Are developing to decarbonize. And I welcome you all to have a look at our website. And if there is any way in which we can assist yourselves, with in the end, such initiatives. In the end, we're all living in the same world. More than happy to help you. More than happy to feel free to send me any questions. Feel free to send me any questions.
Gracias a los panelistas, muy interesantes y prometedoras los aspectos que nos presentaron. Ahora pasamos al tema de financiamiento.
Now we are going to financing. Denise Ovara will be the leading expert of the IDB. Denise, you have the floor. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you very much. We would like to welcome our panelists for this session in financing. Today, we have the presence of Martin Duhart from IDB Invest, Lucia Spinelli from the World Bank Group, Enrique Rodriguez from the European Investment Bank. This session will be developed with 2 questions for the 3 panelists. And the first question is, what are the conditions that you consider are necessary to attract the funding necessary for the system, for the waterway transportation?
Let's start with Martín.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Denise.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I am part of the BID group within BID Invest, and our group works with non-sovereign financing. And some panelists have been previously talking and presenting some of the issues that are considered relevant when getting funding. First, we need to define the necessary investment to finance, and from that perspective, of course, we have to consider the issue of barges, new barges, of course, self-propelled barges, and we would need some sort of tugboats, or maybe not. But beyond the issue of barges, it's also necessary to define other types of infrastructure that would be considered essential when driving forward a fuel transition throughout river transport. For example, issues that have been mentioned to a certain extent, for example, to promote investment on gas pipes. What are the types of investments necessary for infrastructure, especially river infrastructure, storage, safety, loaders, and in order to achieve and obtain investment, we need to have a regulatory framework that includes all of the potentially participating countries in the change and transition of transport. Definition of controversy resolution scheme, pricing schemes. Also, from the fuel viewpoint, we need to assess a framework that provides certainty to the regulations regarding fuels. These are the issues that I believe are most valuable when assessing and considering issues related to financing. And of course, I should not forget to mention the vessels, the ships themselves. We have the ship owners, and we need to know whether these ships will be built within the region or outside of the region. And of course, the legal framework for funding are crucial items that should be considered when considering a switch or modification of river fuel and funding. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you, Martin. So now we are going to listen to Lucia. Thank you, Denise, very much. Thank you, the organizers, for the invitation to participate in this interesting seminar. I would like to add to the words of Martin in relation to investments and also the sequence, how will the process unfold for the investments that Martin was talking about so that investors feel attracted to be part of the system. So what are the main steps or the first steps? An interesting point is how this, let's say, possible modification of the energy has an impact in the electrical grid, in the electrical matrix, and what are the possibilities. So this is an interesting proposal. By all means, it's a proposal that everybody is considering in the short to mid term with, let's say, a more ambitious long-term view, shifting to hydrogen or electrical, but understanding gas as a short to mid-term solution. Another point to consider is how this all plays with the gas consumption in the country, what happens with the winter peak in Argentina, what happens with the import requirements of gas from Bolivia, and how this gas demand really plays in this atmosphere of a context of local production, the development of Vaca Muerta field. So these are all topics that really should be part of the discussion and the conditions to attract financing. So this is a project that is specific to the waterway, but should also articulate and coordinate with other factors in a country that has an important gas penetration, particularly for household consumption. Again, so all these elements must be orchestrated in a coordinated manner so that these possibilities are really implemented in a way that there are certainties not only for investors but also certainties for end users that they will have gas supply. So this is more or less what the other speaker talked about, the use of the barges, the vessels, and the gasification infrastructure.
Thank you, Lucia. We will now listen to Enrique Rodriguez from the European Investment Bank. Please go ahead, Enrique. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Of course, Martín and Lucia mentioned several elements, and I would like to add our perspective. And of course, this is a regional project, and funders usually aspire to get more information on the strategic aspect because these are medium long-term investments. So it is important to know about the strategy behind these specific investments. And of course, it's a regional project. Therefore, there must be a political support to this initiative in terms of integrating the main goal of this river transport and its relationship with intersectorial development of the member countries. So I believe that this is a higher level perspective. At project level, it should comply with the due diligence process, which are the usual processes in these infrastructure projects, technical, economic, and financial feasibility, and of course, the environmental aspect. This project makes a lot of sense for the environment and also in compliance with standards, international standards. Less presence of sulfur in the fuels is a necessary aspect to consider. This is something that you need to consider. We understand that these are transitional steps and they have to be sustained in the medium and long term. So we should aspire to fuels that are more reduced in their levels of carbon content. So we should go beyond gas and LNG. And of course, the regulatory framework, especially the standards and regulations that have to be specified as to security, safety, and management of the energy sources throughout the entire supply chain, end users, and the entire infrastructure entailed. So these are my comments. Thank you. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you to all panelists. for sharing your perspectives on funding. And now we will go on to our second question, which have to do with the areas and opportunity that you envision for multilateral banks want to support these endeavors, these joint ventures. We will start with Martín.
Thank you, Denise. I think that this situation of changing fuels in the waterway involving several countries is a great opportunity for the multilateral entities to participate actively. And I imagine the IDB, for example, working as a whole, working from the sovereign and non-sovereign part in order to supplement this change. And from the sovereign perspective, I believe that the bank could have an important role as a broker among the countries in facilitating the best practices and international experiences, for instance, as regards the regulatory framework matters, or the dispute settlement matters, or common regulations. So those are elements where the bank can really take part. From the non-sovereign perspective, where I work, particularly matters related to funding, I believe there is an interesting opportunity there to participate in funding efforts for the various stages from the infrastructure point of view. So we mentioned at a point whether there was the need to make investments in the land infrastructure, for instance, in the gas pipeline sector, or in the port area, or in the warehouse and storage facilities. Obviously, we do have experience in those type of funding activities, but also in the issue of the barges, the vessels per se. So these are very specific funding activities. We need to determine a series of characteristics. There should be a certain volume for the funding to be of use. Some years ago, for you to know, we funded together with the IFC and the World Bank a very important investment program that involved new barges to transport mineral ore in the waterway. So those type of funding efforts, as I said before, require many elements that must fit in very well in order to make the funding worth it. On the other hand, a simpler activity or a simpler operation could also be considered for existing ship owners, for instance. And there are fundamental aspects, in addition to the funding, the credit worthiness of the ship owners, the guarantees that they can provide, but also from the environmental and social perspective. That is no minor issue and should be part of the integral analysis that we make when we really address a non-sovereign project. So with this, Denise, you have the floor again so that my colleagues can also continue. Thank you, Martin. So now we would like to listen to Lucia with the perspective of the World Bank.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Martin. I agree with Martin. These are issues where multilateral banks can contribute at different instances, of course, as a World Bank. As Martin mentioned, we have two sides, the World Bank that operates with the sovereign part with the states, the countries, and the non-sovereign side, which operates with the private sector. So what is it that the World Bank Group can do? The important thing here is the global vision to frame this within in a regional development framework and see how this would impact in the Mesopotamia, the littoral area. What impact would a fuel change have, something that goes beyond the waterway itself? So this would be a global vision of regional development, including economic and social factors, so that there could be a trickle down or a spill down in the local areas, which is something that we are used to doing. We need to see the big picture to see how each of the areas play out within the general framework. Also, strategic and regulatory issues are important, sustainability issues, these are all issues that can be channeled through the technical assistance side. We usually apply to different funds for energy issues, or maybe we can find in some of these specific funds some room to apply specific funding, of course, something that is quite restricted in size, but very specific for issues that can contribute to the waterway development. And of course, if the member countries think that this is a priority, then we can have a larger scale funding, as Martin was saying. But there are different possibilities. We can have a big, large scheme, if this is something that is picked up by the government, or more specific sectorial issues such as transportation, energy, through the specific funds, of course, always within the energy transition viewpoint, going forward in sustainability, which are things that the World Bank always supports. Thank you very much, Lucia. And now we will have the word of Enrique Rodriguez from the European Investment Bank.
Thank you very much. Well, from the European Investment Bank, this is another opportunity that would very well align to our interests outside Europe. It's true that 80-90% of our business is in Europe, but the 10% which is outside of Europe has a very strong focal point in reducing greenhouse gases, in preserving the climate, and we are very strict towards the environmental impact and climate impact implications. And that would also apply to this case, of course, considering everything that was expressed before. In general, we usually offer what any bank offers and lends, but also guarantees. We require support from the European Commission in order to offer lending and also softening of our financial resources, subsidies and grants in funding. For example, if the waterway decided to explore the next steps, that is to say, the intermediate stage and transition stage, and if it wanted to explore the use of methanol, hydrogen, we are confident that the European Commission would welcome supporting those endeavors, not only with financial resources, but also with advisory, which is the third pillar of the interventions we have. And in terms of advisory, we have very concrete interventions. We've been working the activities in the Rhine and in the Danube rivers that have very similar characteristics as those of the Paraguay Waterway, but we also try to offer the 2.0 version, as I say, in our projects. That is to say, not only limited to a specific project, but, for instance, addressing other cross-sector aspects of the project. For instance, how can the investment be adapted to climate change? How can we associate the waterway operation that prevents flooding, or the alternative business that is related to the use of basins, including the tourist aspect as well. So we try to address our operations in a comprehensive and overall manner whenever we take part in a project. And to conclude, I would like to express that we are very happy to cooperate with other multilateral agencies outside of Europe and also with the World Bank, with our counterparts in Latin America. We feel very, very comfortable sharing our efforts and expanding our efforts with other agencies. Thank you. Thank you very much, Enrique. So now we are going to close this session, and I would like to confirm the key role of funding in the development of the waterway. We were able to share the challenges and opportunities that are emerging for our institutions, such as those from a multilateral bank. Thank you very much, Denise. Thank you, the panelists as well.
Now we invite Pablo Garcia, Director of the Institute for Regional Development and Integration, INTAL, for his consideration related to regional development and integration. He's from INTAL.
Thank you for allowing me to share this part of the workshop with you. It is a fundamental session for the Paraná-Paraguay Waterway, OLADE, and the IDB. It's a pity that we couldn't be in person, but I really wanted to take part. I would like to start by thanking Romina, the Executive Secretary of the Committee, for the invitation to participate and for her leadership in promoting the work of the committee, which is key to consolidate the project. And allow me to share with you very briefly what we do and how we can help, what we do in INTAL, how we can help with all the things that you've been mentioning these days. At INTAL, we are part of the Inter-American Development Bank. We are a division of the IDB, and we focus mainly on the integration projects. Our main role is to support the development of integration processes in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we do it in different ways. We generate information, we create an agenda of studies and research studies, trying to use those studies for dialogue and discussion towards decision-making processes. This is part of our work. We also provide technical and financial assistance to the countries in order to implement integration projects. We have a whole training agenda for the public sector and for the private sector too, related to the integration processes. And we also have an important agenda that is intended to get the academia, the public sector, and the private sector all together for the benefit of the projects. A few days ago, we closed a call for research proposals where we try to find out among the academia, the private sector, the public sector, trying to find out ideas to work in the post-pandemic period. And we received over 200 proposals from over 600 researchers all over the world. And today we have a huge group of people helping us think about the day after the pandemic. So one proposal that I make to all of you, why don't we think in these terms for the waterway? Maybe we can do the same thing for next year. So based on the agenda for the waterway and based on the topics that you are working on, we can do the same thing for the waterway altogether. This is the value proposition that we have at the INTAL, trying to work for a better dialogue for decision making. So in this context, the Paraguay-Paraná Waterway is for us the most relevant natural infrastructure of the southern cone. It is composed of a vital geopolitical space for our countries, becoming a key platform for the insertion of the region into the economic context. The waterway mobilizes $100 million tons a year. It is the main route of transportation for the farming sector in Argentina via Paraguay, Uruguay, and it is estimated that by 2030 the total transported will reach 300 million tons a year. So we are talking about a huge operation, a huge success in terms of economy and trade. Now, the waterway is not only a waterway infrastructure, but it is also an open space for the development, the human development, the economic development in the areas that are adjacent to the waterway. So throughout this workshop, you've been discussing about the cases of Europe, where all the waterways have been very important, not only for trade, but also for the economic regional development. And they are key elements to the regional integration of our countries. Now, moving on to the more specific workshop topics, I think that this workshop has been vital considering the current dialogue, fuels, and the resulting decarbonization is a fundamental step in order to build an efficient and environmentally sustainable waterway. The scenario of the worldwide navigation is following that path. The objectives to reduce emissions by 50%, as set by the IMO by 2050, the reduction of sulfur, the reduction for 0.5%, and this continued and sustained transformation that the global fleets have had, migrating to liquefied natural gas. So from INTAL, we have a very close approach to integration processes, and we are always trying to see how companies can participate in these integration processes. And in general, the environmental concern is increasingly present and is a differentiating element in relation to the efficiency and the location of the businesses and companies. This will be vital not only for the waterway development, but also for the regional economic growth through the waterway. In order to make headway, I believe that pushing the integration forward is key. Integration is not an end in itself, but rather it's an instrument that allows us to create common policies. Creating those policies requires technical work, but also a very important political effort. We will have to reach consensus. We know that sometimes it's very hard to agree on small things in a family, so imagine how complex it might be to reach consensus among countries, particularly in this topic of fuel replacement. But it's key that we make an effort in order to push this type of dialogue forward, in order to include technical knowledge in our dialogue. INTAL is at your disposal to give you all the support that we can, as much as we can, from the technical perspective to the dialogue perspective, in order to reach the necessary consensus for the consolidation of the Waterway. Without further ado, this is my message to you, and thank you once more for allowing me to participate at this event.
Thank you, Pablo, for your relevant considerations related to regional development and the economic integration of the region that these initiatives allow us to achieve. Now we will go on to the Q&A session. We have received several questions and comments and remarks in our chat. So we invite Mariano Alvarez Wagner from CIH to moderate the Q&A session. Thank you very much, Roberto. It is quite interesting to see how this webinar, this seminar is unfolding. We have received several questions from our audience, many from today and others from Tuesday. Many of the questions that we weren't able to answer live, we answer them through our Q&A chat. We take the most representative ones live, and then we write the answers to the rest of the questions in our chat. So we will start our Q&A session now. Let's take a general question which represents most of the questions regarding regulations. My question is for Raúl Berteros from the Regulatory Activity Agency in Argentina. How do you manage for regulations to promote innovation and technological development? And the other one, is it necessary to have ideological similarities, or is it necessary to have this sync in ideologies to achieve a successful regional unity? Interesting questions. I would say that it's important not just for regulations to avoid the hindrance of technical development, but rather to promote it. It shouldn't be stopping technological development. And for this, regulations should not be mandatory by prohibiting things, but rather to be performance-based. That is to say, we want to reduce contamination, we want to reduce carbon content or CO2 content to such a level. So this will allow constant technological development to achieve this, to look for a solution in a more efficient way. It's important to build through regulations an observatory for new technologies and innovation with the participation of different universities of the different countries in the region. University and academia participation is relevant in order to help us detect new developments that can be implemented throughout the waterway and any venture for that matter. So I think it's something that's important to consider for regulations. And whether ideological affinity is a necessary condition for successful regulations, where regulations balance out interests and looks for the best situation for each one of the member countries of a joint venture, a joint activity. Therefore, in this sense, ideological affinity does not play a key role. In Europe, affinity in ideologies was developed after wars, a big difference between what one country thinks and another one thinks on a vast number of issues. However, regulation and regulations development has been advancing constantly. Therefore, there is no condition for affinity in ideologies to be able to build this integration. Thank you, Raúl. Very clear answer. We understand then that interests move our achievement of regulations, and the European example is very clear on that. Now let's go on to the following question. This question has to do with yesterday's cost-related panel, and the question is for Raúl Podetti. Well, these are two questions, in fact. One
Uno
has
sería
to
cómo
do
se
to
podrían
the
financiar, es bien directa y
financing.
concreta, cómo se
It's
podrían
very concrete
financiar las
question.
nuevas
New
construcciones a
constructions
GNL.
to switch to
Y la otra
LNG,
es,
and
para
the
la
other one is
hidrovía
that
Paraguay-Paraná,
whether for
¿sería
this PP
recomendable el dual
waterway
fuel,
would
el
be
combustible
recommendable
dual?
to
¿Y
have
por
dual
qué, en caso de
fuels,
serlo?
and if so,
Por
why?
favor, Raúl.
Please, Raúl.
Bueno,
Thank you.
gracias.
Let's
Vamos a
start
empezar
with
por la
the
última,
second
que es más
question because it's
fácil. La
easier.
otra
The other
por ahí
one,
es
it's
más
more
interesante para
complex to explain.
El
Dual
fuel, en
fuel,
este
in
caso
our case,
nuestro,
I
me parece que
believe
ni
that
siquiera es un
it's
tema de
not even
discusión, porque me refiero
an issue up for
desde el
debate.
punto de vista del
And
costo.
I'll explain
Porque
why
la
I say
oferta
this.
de
This
dual
is from the
fuel
cost
es
viewpoint. The
amplia,
offer
diría
of dual fuel is
mayoritaria.
quite
Y
broad,
hay una razón
and
estratégica.
there's a strategic
Yo
reason
no
for this.
recomendaría
I
a
would
ningún
not
armador de
recommend
hidrovía
the
hoy
shipbuilders or ship owners
que tome otra opción que no
to
sea dual fuel.
take any other option that's not dual
Ante
fuel,
una
because if you have
emergencia,
an
como decía
emergency, as
Carlos
Carlos
Rodríguez
said
ayer
yesterday,
en el chat,
or
o ante cualquier
in light of
situación de
any
falta de
lack of
suministro,
supply,
por lo menos por
which
varios
is
años
something that
todavía,
might happen in
el
the following
diésel
years,
va a estar
diesel
disponible.
will be
Entonces,
available. So
definitivamente es
it
una
is a
razón estratégica
strategic
de seguridad del
safety
servicio
and
y lo que uno
service-based
llama en esto
decision in this
análisis
systemic
sistémico,
analysis that we
el
do. This is
reliability
considering
del
the main
sistema
issue, which is
con sistemas duales.
reliability. And reliability is best achieved with
Ahora, sí,
dual fuel
respecto del
systems. Now,
financiamiento,
regarding
tengo
funding,
que
I should
comentar
say
que
that
después
after
de lo que yo
what I
considero que es
consider
la
is the
clave de esto,
key
que es
of this,
la
which is
reglamentación de un área de control de
regulation of
emisiones que
an
tenga
area
muy
that has
fuerte,
a very
definida
strict
y sobre todo
emission
sostenida.
control and
El
sustained
segundo punto
throughout
más
time. The second
importante
issue
es el
has to do with
financiamiento. Y no
financing.
diría el
And I wouldn't
financiamiento de
say
los barcos,
financing
es el
for the vessels,
financiamiento de
but
la
financing for the
descarbonización del
decarbonization
transporte
of
naval.
the river transport.
Y la buena
The good
noticia
news is
es que
that
dentro de los
within
financiamientos
naval
navales
financing options,
es de
it's
los más
one of the
sencillos.
simplest ones
Porque
because
tiene los
it
elementos que
contains
cualquier
the elements
financista
that
naval
any
adora.
naval
Por ejemplo, la
funder loves,
atomización y
which
la
is
homogeneidad.
atomization and
Hay muchos
homogeneity. There are a
armadores,
lot of ship
decenas,
owners, there are a
hay
lot of
muchos astilleros
shipbuilders in
en la
the
región,
region, at
por lo menos
least 15.
15.
There are a
Hay
lot
muchas
of
unidades a
units to be
reemplazar,
replaced,
que son
which are
sencillas,
simple,
más
over
de
200 of
200,
them,
que
which are
son
simple,
sencillas
relatively
relativamente
simple,
a los barcos que
compared
andan en el
to
mundo,
the
los
ships we
remotores de buques son
see
de los más
throughout the
sencillos
world.
que hay.
Ours are very
Son
simple. These
unidades
are
similares
units that resemble
y
each
son
other,
de bajo
and
costo.
they're low cost units,
Entre 3
between
y 10
$3 and
millones de
$10
dólares.
million.
No hay
There are
muchos
not many
barcos en el
ships
mundo
throughout the
más
world
baratos
that
que
are
estos,
cheaper than these,
con un
with an
promedio de
average of
5 millones
$5
de dólares.
million
Entonces,
per
y
vessel.
además encima
And
se construyen
they
rápido,
are built
porque una vez que
quite
estás en un sistema de
fast,
producción,
because if
se
they are
tarda
inside
meses
a
en
production
entregar
system, it's
remolcadores de
just
6 o
months
años.
for a
¿Ok?
tugboat, not years.
Además,
Therefore,
operan
they
dentro de un
operate
mercado
within a very
predecible,
predictable
que
market,
tiene tanto un
specific
tráfico, un área
traffic amount,
geográfica, y hasta te
geographic
diría
area, and
costos,
costs and
cargas,
cargoes and
fletes,
freights. All
todo
of
muy
them are
predecible.
quite
Todo
predictable.
esto
So
son
these are
las
all
cosas
the
que los
things that
financistas
the funding agencies
adoran,
or funders
porque no hay
love,
demasiados
because
riesgos
there is
entonces.
no
Ahora,
risk involved
hay otro
here.
aspecto
But
muy
there's another
importante.
aspect to consider.
Hay tres
There are
grupos de
three
beneficiarios
different
gigantes
big
en este sistema. Por un lado son los
parts
estados
that
ribereños,
benefit from this. The
que
coastal
quieren que este
states,
servicio, que es
this is a
estratégico y tiene un gran
strategic
impacto en su
service and has an
competitividad,
impact in competitiveness.
tome
Therefore,
este tipo
they
de
want to get
solución.
this type of solution. There's
El otro
another
beneficiario
part that
directo del
benefits,
cual hemos
direct
hablado poco en estos días,
part,
son los
are the
cargadores.
loaders.
Mega
These are
empresas, mega
mega
corporaciones, los
corporations,
Cargill, los
Cargill,
ADM,
ADM,
los Ternium,
Terium.
que necesitan que sus
They need their
productos
products to
ganen
be more
competitividad
competitive. And
y
also,
además que se hagan más
they have to
amigables al
be
ambiente. De
friendly
esa
with the
forma van a
environment,
poder
because in
cumplir
such a way
esto
they
que
can
pregonan en
comply with what they say in
misiones,
their
sus
missions
peticiones,
and
y
vision
que
statements.
ahora tienen la
And now they
oportunidad
have a
concreta de
concrete
ayudar a que
chance
ocurra y
to
que
make
sean
this happen,
realmente
and that
productos
they are really
ecológicos también en el
ecological
transporte
and
marítimo.
green
Y finalmente,
products
el tercero
also
de
in the
los grupos
transport of
que
them.
se
And
beneficia
also
muy
a third
fuertemente de
part
esto
that
son
benefits from it
los
are the
proveedores de
suppliers
equipos
or vendors of imported equipment. 50% of the investment on these barges and tugboats and vessels are imported parts or imported equipment that come from abroad. Therefore, we have excellent funding for that. So this is a financing scheme or model. So we're saying that it's a good thing for the ship owners who are the takers of the loan have to participate at least in 10% of the funding, and 30% of the amount to be financed should be covered by institutions, the government or development banks like the IDB or the World Bank, and also getting funding from this gigantic flow towards developing countries of green funds and the climate bonds. So both the government and these funding agencies or banks have environmental and development issues, reasons to fund, to provide funding. But the biggest side should come from the foreign investment funds, 60% at least, for commercial reasons, not environmental reasons or development reasons, but because it is a good business deal for them. They should sell our products because we shouldn't allow them to sell us the ships. They should sell us a Solomonic solution for them to sell us half of the ships. That is to say, the equipment on the ships. But we should build the ships using the parts and the equipment they sell us. And this is very important. This is a very important part of the funding. When I talk about the financing from international suppliers or vendors, people are surprised. In 1989, in our small shipyard in Dock Sur, in Avellaneda, we signed a contract with Germany to build a number of container carriers, and 100% of the funding was provided by the Germans, and we bought the equipment from them, and we did the engineering and labor and materials and services. And we did the same in 97 with Haltin Marine to build tugboats to be exported to Paraguay. And with Trinity Industries, the biggest barge producer in the world, we did the same thing at the end of 1999 to build serial production barges. 100% funding from them. They gave us the supplies and we put the service and the labor. In 2017, a few years back, for the Argentine naval industry, we signed an agreement with IHC so that all the vessels, all the ships in the agreement would be funded or financed by the European Economic Community if we bought the equipment from them, and the ships were built, 100% built in Argentina, but the funding was 100% provided by Europe. So it's a very interesting scheme, and it's also a scheme through which companies will have to compete against each other to get this funding. Thank you, Raúl Podetti, from the Argentine Association of Naval Engineers. Silvana asked you a question on Tuesday talking about reduction in costs. Well, we can see how everything fits together and how this is retrofeeding the system. Now, before going to the funding side of our talk, because we have many questions regarding financing and how to make it effective and how to achieve decarbonization of the river fleet, I will go now to a more provisioning or supply related question. This is for Scalani from YPF. how could YPF make sure, considering the contract already established, the production of LNG for the waterway fleet, and how long would this take to be operative if we have such a big investment?
Very interesting question indeed. Let me try to split it into parts. In relation to the provisioning and supply, YPF made a proposal, including all the input elements that I mentioned before. The idea is that YPF has a benefit in return for making the investment in infrastructure. There would be no reason why YPF wouldn't want to supply fuel upon demand. On the other hand, the contractual framework will set obligations and sanctions or certain penalties. So that would be a safer framework to work. Second, it would be very interesting to establish orders of magnitude. According to the figures analyzed by YPF in 2019, supplying the total number of tugboats with LNG would account for 1% of the country demand for natural gas. So we estimate that there will be no scarcity of the product. Also, the other demands will internally emerge in Argentina. So we see that as time goes by, we will have an entire infrastructure network of LNG. So we will not rely on a single unit to provide LNG, but rather we will have a whole network and system of LNG supply. So as the different demand points evolve and grow, we will have like a network of LNG terminals. So we do not foresee a scarcity of the supply. Now, in relation to the timeline, well, it's very hard to make estimates. We don't have accurate information yet. The time to provision and supply, but what we know and what we believe in general terms is that once all the conditions are in place and once the demand is defined, we would start the construction process, the equipment procurement process. So from the point of demand definition to the time of operation, we do not see that it will be below 1 year or before 1 year. So we are considering from 1 year onwards. That would be the term for supply. Thank you very much, Cesar. A very clear answer. Now, I would like to move on to the financing questions per se. And the first question, or rather the first two questions, are for Martín Rath, the representative of the IDB. So one question is very specific. In your quality as representative of the IDB Invest, the private arm of the IDB. So in case there was a company that wanted to develop this type of initiatives as part of its business plan, how should it start talks with IDB Invest? Thank you for your question, first of all. Well, actually, it is a very simple step. They just need to contact us, and we are in Washington, but also, as is my case, in the office in Buenos Aires. So whenever there is a concrete case of a business that is interested, I think that we should consider certain aspects. First, it is important to think whether the business wants to start this financing scheme as a more, let's say, corporate like financing, let's think about a company that is already operating in the waterway, for example. Well, in that case, probably that company would have some advantages because working on the financing of a currently operating company, a company that wants to make a partial reconversion or a total reconversion of its fleet and of its infrastructure in relation to its port or in relation to its warehouse facilities. That's one thing. When we talk about corporate financing, what we do is to analyze a set of investment actions that are part of the cost of the project, and we can fund or finance a percentage of the total. So what we usually do, along with the company, we try to add other financiers. It could be credit companies, commercial banks, whatever is available. Another point to consider is the jurisdiction, the territory where we are going to grant our financing. We, as a regional bank, are open in almost every country. However, there are different limits. For instance, if we finance under the project finance modality, our limits are larger in the small countries rather than in the big countries. So if we are going to offer a financing in Paraguay, we can finance up to 40% of the project costs. This project finance modality is a more complex modality that, as the name indicates, the purpose is that the financing has resources against the project. So it requires complete and more profound studies. It requires interacting with a series of assessments and flow analysis of different scenario analysis. And then the legal documentation is more complex. And it is really worth it as long as the financing has a certain volume and size. Otherwise, it would be more reasonable to think of corporate financing to a company that already exists. So, in summary, we, as a development bank, are very interested in this type of investments that can have a positive impact for the climate change by replacing dirty fuel with a transition fuel as is natural gas. Thank you, Martin. Very clear. And the other part of the question has to do with the technologies that are still not mature, so that they really show a reduction in the operating costs. And the question is, what are the financing possibilities of pilot projects with top-notch technologies, for instance, electric batteries? That's a great question. And as a development bank, in the issue of renewable, non-conventional energies, we are very much interested in following the state-of-the-art opportunities. And as the IDB, we try to achieve these efforts in a coordinated manner, both on the IDB Invest side as well as on the side of working together with the IDB specialists. For IDB Invest, what we do is to finance companies, for example, under the project finance modality or under the corporate financing modality. And what we think is, let's say, simpler to incorporate these new opportunities are particularly including them as part of a project. Let me share with you some examples. Let's assume that we are considering to finance, for example, a photovoltaic plant, a solar generator. Okay, in that case, and here we need to consider what the IDB can provide in order to favor governments or in order to help governments change certain regulations. We can improve batteries in a solar project, but we should always follow a purpose. So, for instance, there should be a regulation in place that encourages people or encourages promoters to get an investment in batteries. So if we have a purpose, if we have an intention and a rationale behind including the batteries into an integral project is easier. And the same for hydrogen and all the applications that are being studied at transportation level. So let's assume that we have a company that has its own transport fleet. Then it would be simpler and easier to put that company as part of a financing package and to include, for instance, transport through green hydrogen basis. So these are the ways that from the IDB Invest perspective, these are the ways that would be simpler to include and incorporate to be at the vanguard of these regional, non-conventional and renewable energies that are being developed in the world and we can incorporate into the region. We also have some licensing funds. We need to see case by case whether we can include those into the projects and in that way cut costs. On the other hand, the IDB part usually works with donors and special funds and the governments too, in order to work on the regulatory framework, as I mentioned before, which is a key aspect because the regulations are the triggers. But also, in the world of energy, there are some state-owned companies, for example, or other companies that may have a state majority, perhaps, where the IDB also tries to start pilot projects in order to offer more, let's say, confidence to the private companies to introducing hydrogen at a greater scale. So the pilot project in those cases has the role of, let's say, proving that technology works, showing how important it is for the private sector to invest. Therefore, as you can see, we are highly interested in developing hydrogen solutions, batteries solutions, and any other new technology that emerges in the field of renewable energies. And for that, we have different supplementary roads at the IDB. So we, on the IDB Invest side, at the project level as well as at the IDB side, working with specific licensing funds for topics related to changes in regulations, prove to promote investments at high scale with the private sector.
We agree, Martin, that it is necessary to plant the seed, although technologies are not yet mature enough. We're a bit behind in our agenda, but I have one more question I would like to ask also to the financial organization representatives. Silvana, we talked about regional funding and regulation to Mr. Bertero, and now we will be dealing with the content of the scheme. This is for Lucia. Lucia, what's the importance of a coordinated need for regional organization and for the incentives for the region? I believe that in this project, like in any other project that involves several players, private and public players, several countries, and medium and long-term investments, we should have a clear incentives plan, coordinated plans. This is a great advantage, not just for the players themselves, but also for the agencies that do the financing to have some feasible plan into the future to know that the standards and regulations are coordinated, that the infrastructure is also coordinated. This is an essential topic to consider, and also everything related to safety, especially when we're dealing with LNG. Of course, the answer is yes, it is a challenge that we need to face, but this will allow projects such as this one to become a reality. In the waterway, you do have this coordination instance, so it will be easier and you can take advantage of this to leverage on it. Thank you, Lucia, for your answer. I'm so sorry that we went a little bit beyond the agenda, but I thought that the regional coordination was an interesting topic, especially to get the answers from the agencies and the investment agencies. I thank you for your answers. I hope that we were able to shed some light on these topics. Thank you, Mariano. We thank the audience for the questions and remarks. We have now reached the end of our webinar, and for final remarks and future steps, and for the closing remarks of this webinar, we pass on the mic to Mrs. Bocache. She is in charge of the CIH. Go ahead, Romina. Thank you, Roberto. It is for me an honor to be closing the final session of this important webinar. I would like to share with you some ideas and preliminary conclusions after the comments we've received throughout these sessions. I believe that it is convenient to go forward with the replacement of bankard fuels that are currently used in the Paraná-Paraguay Waterway and switch to other more efficient fuel alternatives that are friendlier with the environment. Why? Because the fuels that are currently used in the waterway have a negative and adverse impact on the environment. They generate greenhouse effect gases and also harmful effects on health because of other harmful emissions such as PM, sulfur oxide, and nitrous gases. So what are the alternatives? We have to make a difference between the medium term and the long term. At a medium term, we have a good candidate to replace our fuels right now. And this is because of a series of issues. First, a lower price, therefore operational costs are reduced, and this would have a positive effect on systemic competitiveness of the waterness. On the other side, LNG also reduces different types of emissions, and of course this would also have a positive effect on the environment. And also LNG is a mature technology. LNG is now being used to propel several types of vessels and ships, and it is a resource that is generated in different regions in the countries involved. And this would have a positive impact on the environment and also on the social side. It will generate quality employment in the naval industry and in the merchant marine industry, which is the mother of many other industries. Now, regarding the long term, there are other options such as electric battery and hydrogen, especially considering the big potential of production of renewable energies in the regions like hydroelectric, solar, and wind energy sources. So we should carry out pilot, small-scale projects that would allow us to generate different types of capabilities and capacities in areas which are knowledge intensive in the region. So all of these alternatives that we have considered in the webinar have positive externalities subject to different times. And how can we implement the use of these alternative fuels throughout our waterway? Well, I believe that in these 2 days, we have made it clear that there are 3 big pillars. One has to do with regulations, clear rules, previsibility, and investment possibilities and safety to be able to plan to carry out investments and transformations necessary. But also regulations must allow to promote the development of technologies because these are evolving and dynamic technologies. And another important part has to do with the financing both for the public and the private sectors. LNG, because it reduces operational costs, then we could generate financial schemes that allow investments to be reimbursed with the savings. In projects related to climate change linked to renewable energy sources have plenty possibilities of investment in different funds and agencies. And an important pillar, which we also mentioned throughout the webinar, has to do with coordination, the importance of coordinations among the member countries of the waterway to be able to advance, to work jointly, coordinating policies and strategies in communication with the different parties involved, ship owners, shipyards, loaders, ports. All of them must be involved in the process. Why do I say this? Well, because I believe that this initiative represents an opportunity for the development of our region. And as you have heard, this is a big integration and development project in the region. So this fits in this framework. Therefore, we need to have a public-private articulation that's healthy, that's intelligent through communication challenges encompassed by an institution such as CIH. What are our next steps? Well, we have created a group of experts within the executive secretariat of CIH, made up experts assigned by the different countries, and they might invite other specialists to make the dialogue even better. Our next meeting will be on November 30, and this is to present or submit different alternatives or road map to be able to go forward. This should be submitted to our executive secretariat at the CIH. I would like to thank the joint work and cooperation amongst the 3 organizations that have been part of this workshop, IDB, OLADE, and CIH. And I would like to express our willingness to continue forward with this synergy. And I would also like to highlight the commitment of Roberto Aiello, because from the very beginning he has been working relentlessly to organize this webinar. Thank you very much, Roberto, for your hard work. I would also like to thank the panelists, to all of them, men and women who have participated in this webinar. We cannot name them all because there are more than 30, but it was a big challenge to be able to provide brief presentations with brilliant presentations, very clear presentations in such a short time. And I would like to also celebrate the number of women that have been part of this webinar, which is not something that's usual in meetings in this sector. So I celebrate women's participation. I hope that more and more women participate in our future webinars and debates. I would also like to thank Globalports for their excellent broadcasting and the technical setup that has allowed us to reach all of you in this way, and also the media that have been helping us disseminate the information to multiply our message, and the audience that has been joining us in these last two sessions with their comments and their questions. Thank you very much. We will continue working on these topics. We are here for anything you need. Thank you very much to each and every one of you.